Chapter 26. 5 Points for Gryffindor. Professor McGonagall was stunned. She had been transforming into a tabby cat to teach the first transfiguration class to new students for many years. Because this little trick, like the sorting ceremony, was required to be kept strictly confidential, she had been able to observe generations of new students from a cat's perspective for so many years. It was quite amusing. The vast majority of new students couldn't see the mystery of this cat, assuming that the teacher hadn't arrived, and made loud noises without any restraint, not stopping even when class time arrived. This year was no exception. Perhaps because of Harry Potter's enrollment, the little lions this year were particularly excited, glancing in Harry's direction every few sentences. Watching their performance, McGonagall had even already thought of her concluding remarks at the end of this class. "You are the worst class I have ever taught." But she never expected that one day, she would be picked up by a student by the scruff of her neck. Unbelievable. Friends who often pet cats know that felines have a fatal weakness. As long as you pinch the back of their necks, no matter how fierce and unruly they usually are, they will become docile and obedient, allowing you to manipulate them. Cats in the magical world are no exception. Furthermore, any wizard who transforms into an animal through animagus will possess the characteristics of that animal. This tabby cat was precisely Professor McGonagall transformed through animagus. So, she was caught off guard and ambushed by Sherlock. She wanted to resist, but because of the feline's nature, she couldn't break free. After finally waiting for human nature to overcome animal instincts and gain the upper hand, Sherlock had already released the scruff of her neck, put her in his arms, and began to pet her. Sherlock's cat petting skills were quite skilled, gently stroking and kneading, quickly making Professor McGonagall sink into it, unable to extricate herself. "Sherlock, don't you think the patterns around this cat's eyes look a lot like Professor McGonagall's glasses?" After Sherlock explained the difference between seeing and observing, Harry had been constantly learning. So, when he discovered this, he was very excited. He had long heard that if you keep a pet for a long time, the owner and the pet will become more and more alike. Sherlock had just said that this wasn't Professor McGonagall's pet. Now it seemed that he was finally wrong this time. Harry was slightly smug, but he didn't say this explicitly. After all, Sherlock was so smart, he must have understood what he meant. Unexpectedly, before Sherlock could answer, the cat seemed to understand his words and suddenly struggled to fall from Sherlock's hands to the ground. The next moment, the tabby cat disappeared, and a serious-looking woman appeared in everyone's sight. She wore an emerald green robe, and her black hair was tied into a tight bun. The square glasses she wore looked exactly like the patterns around the cat's eyes. It was Minerva McGonagall, the deputy headmistress of Hogwarts, the head of Gryffindor House, and the Transfiguration Professor. The new students who saw this scene were stunned. Harry and Ron, who had been watching Sherlock pet the cat, opened their mouths wide enough to stuff a dung bomb in. Ron even had difficulty speaking. "McGonagall, Professor." McGonagall first looked at Harry gratefully, then looked intently at Sherlock. "Mr. Holmes, did you recognize me long ago?" Meeting for the first time, Sherlock was able to deduce that Hogwarts was in Scotland through the texture of the acceptance letter and his analysis of her. Facing a young wizard with such magical abilities, she had no reason not to be suspicious. Looking at Professor McGonagall's serious expression, Harry and Ron suddenly realized what Sherlock had just done. Both of them were immediately covered in sweat. They looked at Sherlock with both admiration and worry, secretly sweating for Sherlock. "Not at all," Sherlock said calmly, "but I have never seen a cat sit so stiffly." Seeing that Sherlock's eyes were clear and didn't seem to be lying, Professor McGonagall's expression softened slightly. He was just a young wizard who yearned for the magical world and had just enrolled. How could he have any bad intentions? "You would be stiff too if you saw your students acting like that." McGonagall's sudden transformation had already attracted the attention of the new students, but this sentence made everyone silent. The professor's transfiguration is almost flawless, and you can't feel the magical aura at all. It's amazing. Only Sherlock still praised Professor McGonagall's wonderful performance, as if he wasn't the one who had been playing with Professor McGonagall just now. "Mr. Holmes, this transformation is called animagus, which allows people to truly become animals. It is a very difficult form of transfiguration. During practice, you may even be unable to transform back into a normal human being due to confusion of thought, which is too dangerous for you now. All right, now everyone get back to your seats, I'm going to start transforming." Hearing that Sherlock hadn't noticed her abnormality, McGonagall secretly breathed a sigh of relief. Mainly because her performance just now was really a bit embarrassing. Actually, she refused when Sherlock started petting her. But in the animagus transformation state, she unconsciously obeyed the cat's nature. In addition, Sherlock's skilled technique quickly made her whole cat doin. Fortunately, Harry suddenly pointed out the characteristics of the patterns around her eyes, which allowed her to wake up from her comfort zone and struggle to transform back to her original form, without embarrassing herself too much. But being petted by a student had already become a fact. At this time, she could only use other methods to divert attention. Fortunately, this was not difficult for her. She first turned her desk into a pig, and then turned it back. The students were indeed attracted and couldn't wait to start learning immediately. However, she poured a bucket of cold water on everyone as soon as she opened her mouth. Transfiguration is the most complex and dangerous spell in your Hogwarts courses. Her eyes swept over everyone, paused briefly on Sherlock and Harry, and continued slowly. Anyone who is naughty in my class, I will ask him to leave and never allow him to come back. I have already warned you. Seeing the students sitting upright one by one, McGonagall was satisfied and began to lecture. It was this lecture that made everyone understand that it would take a long time to turn furniture into animals. You have to start with the basics first. For example, the content of this class is to turn a match into a needle. But this seemingly simple lesson has stumped almost everyone. By the time class was over, only Hermione's match had changed, although one end was still a match head, the other end had become very sharp. McGonagall smiled at her. Seeing McGonagall, who had been serious throughout the class, show a rare smile, Hermione raised her head high, like a proud swan. This is the real Gryffindor, you must have a talent for transfiguration. Then, Gryffindor gains 5 points. Hermione was immediately surprised. That shouldn't be. I heard that Professor McGonagall has always been stingy with points. Although she performed very well, being able to make Professor McGonagall show a smile was already a victory. It shouldn't be enough to add points, right? Chapter 27. Hermione quickly realized she was overthinking it. A series of exclamations came from the table across the aisle from her. Looking over, she was surprised to see that Sherlock had completely transformed his match into a needle. Professor McGonagall didn't hesitate to give her assessment. A transfiguration prodigy. Students who completely transformed their match into a needle received 4 points, while those who only managed to create a needlepoint on one end received 1 point. McGonagall could now justifiably and confidently award points to Gryffindor, and even her gaze towards Sherlock and Hermione became much gentler. It was precisely because of Sherlock and Hermione's outstanding performance that the "you are the worst class I've ever taught" that she had prepared to say at the end of class remained unspoken. However, Hermione knew in her heart that of the 5 points Gryffindor received, only 1 point seemingly came from her own efforts, but without Sherlock, McGonagall wouldn't have given her that point at all. Her transfiguration was only worth a smile, that 1 point was entirely thanks to Sherlock. This instantly gave her the same feeling as Harry and Ron. Being carried by a big shot. But she couldn't bring herself to be happy. Her parents had told her to take care of each other before school started, now it seemed completely unnecessary. Her emotions didn't attract anyone else's attention. The new students continued to attend classes, leave classes, eat, and sleep as usual. Just before going to bed, Harry finally asked the question that had been weighing on his mind all day. Sherlock, did you really not realize that Cat was Professor McGonagall? The other 3 in the dormitory, who had seemingly already fallen asleep, couldn't help but secretly prick up their ears upon hearing Harry's words. Dear Harry, I thought you would have asked me sooner. Sherlock smiled, then immediately posed a counter-question, so, what do you think? Harry thought for a moment, feeling that he should be honest when facing Sherlock. I think you were deceiving her. Harry, you've spotted the blind spot. Sherlock gave an affirmative answer, then calmly said in Harry's surprised gaze. As I said to you before, what we need is observation, not sight. You also noticed the lines around the cat's eyes, but you didn't connect it to Professor McGonagall. The cat's habits are different from those of a normal cat. If you are familiar with the animal, it is easy to see the differences. Of course, the most important thing is that I know about animagi. By putting all these observed results together, it's not difficult to deduce the answer. The difference between observation and sight aside, after hearing Sherlock frankly admit that he had deceived McGonagall, Ron finally couldn't help but sit up. Holy shit! Sherlock, I thought you wouldn't lie. In most cases, I really don't lie, Sherlock said calmly, unless it's necessary. Then today. A white lie is more suitable for someone like Professor McGonagall than the truth. I don't want to be targeted by her in the future. After all, he still planned to explore Hogwarts. Harry and Ron exchanged glances. Their understanding of Sherlock deepened once again. Sherlock originally had high hopes for the Defense Against the Dark Arts course. After all, judging from the current courses, the teachers at Hogwarts were all highly accomplished. Even the History of Magic teacher, Professor Binns, who simply read from the textbook, had knowledge when you actively asked questions. Unexpectedly, Quirinus Quirrell became the exception. During the first class, the entire classroom was filled with the smell of garlic. Although he didn't explain the reason, rumors had it that it was to ward off a vampire he had encountered in Romania. As everyone knew, garlic was an effective means of warding off vampires, and it was understandable that someone as timid and nervous as Quirrell, constantly worried about being harmed by dark creatures, would take such measures. As for himself, he explained his large turban it was a gift from an African prince to thank him for helping the prince escape the clutches of a zombie. The students were skeptical about this. Harry, curious, couldn't help but lower his voice and ask, "Sherlock, is what he's saying true?" Sherlock shook his head. It wasn't a big deal that Quirrell was lying, as long as he could do his job of teaching well. The problem was that Quirrell couldn't. To put it bluntly, this professor was simply a heartless repeating machine. The extent to which he read from the textbook was even worse than Professor Binns in History of Magic. When students asked questions, he would stammer, talk vaguely, and talk about the weather. A course that required the most practical application was turned into this. Sherlock didn't know what to say. It seemed that not all professors at Hogwarts were elites. In contrast, Harry breathed a sigh of relief. Because he found that even other students from wizarding families were about the same level as him. The best performers among the new students were Sherlock and Hermione, who came from Muggle families. This allowed him to joke with Sherlock. "Actually, Professor Quirrell is a good person, I met him in Diagon Alley." Harry told Sherlock about his experience in Diagon Alley, and when he mentioned that Quirrell came from Ravenclaw and was originally very smart, Sherlock frowned. "What's wrong? Harry, what do you think would cause a person's personality to change suddenly?" Harry thought for a moment and said, "Hagrid said that Professor Quirrell wanted to gain first-hand experience, but he encountered vampires and old hags in the dark forest, and that's why he became like this." "A good reason." Noticing Sherlock's disapproving attitude, Harry was surprised. "What, did you think of something?" "My friend, it's always dangerous to reason with insufficient evidence." Sherlock patted Harry on the shoulder and said, "Let's go, it's time for lunch." After finishing the third herbology class of the week in the afternoon, the new students also ushered in the only class of the week that needed to be studied at night. Astronomy. Professor Aurora Sinistra required all new students to observe the night sky with telescopes. The main content was to learn the names of different stars and the trajectories of planetary orbits. Compared to other courses, this course was undoubtedly much simpler. This was the only course that didn't require the use of magic. However, Sherlock, who had performed excellently in other courses, surprised everyone. Because Professor Sinistra had heard about Sherlock and Hermione's deeds before, and given the special nature of this course, she specifically asked Sherlock and Hermione, who came from Muggle families, questions. Hermione's answer was excellent. She not only skillfully recited the names of the 9 planets, but also explained the ecliptic plane and the equatorial plane. But when it was Sherlock's turn, he frankly stated that he knew nothing about it. He didn't even know that the Earth revolved around the Sunday. Everyone was stunned. Chapter 28. The Earth revolves around the Sun, and the Moon revolves around the Earth. This is common knowledge, whether in Muggle or wizarding families. Harry and Ron, in particular, looked at Sherlock as if he were a ghost. Sherlock had always given them the impression of being all-knowing, as if there was nothing in the world he didn't know. Even if he didn't know, it didn't matter, because he could observe and then deduce the result. But what is this all about now? Hermione couldn't help but blurt out, You don't know that the Earth revolves around the Sun. It's really hard to imagine that there are still people in the 20th century who don't know this. You seem surprised. Looking at their expressions, Sherlock laughed. Even if I know these things, I have to try my best to forget them. Forget, why? Sherlock tapped his head with his finger. For me, the brain is like a hard drive, and it only makes sense to put useful things in it. Ordinary people often fill their brains with garbage, and the consequence of doing so is that the knowledge that is useful to them is squeezed out, and when you really need to learn, you will find it difficult. But this is a solar system issue. Hermione's eyes widened, still looking incredulous. So what? Sherlock said in an impatient and rude tone. You say we revolve around the sun, but even if we revolve around the moon or circle around the garden like a little bear, it won't have any impact on me or my life, will it? So stop torturing me with your insights. Hermione. Harry and Ron exchanged glances. What he said makes so much sense, I'm speechless. As if realizing that his tone was a bit excessive, Sherlock then added. Sorry, I seem to have been a bit rude, but that's not important, from today onwards I have to remember these things before this course becomes an elective. Hermione. That day, the entire class of freshmen gained a deeper understanding of Sherlock. Hermione realized that she had misunderstood Sherlock in the past. This person is nothing like me. After Transfiguration and Charms on Thursday, the time came to the last day of the school week. It's bad enough to have classes with Slytherin, having potions class with them is even worse. According to the schedule, the Gryffindor freshmen would have 2 potions classes with the Slytherin students. This also turned every Friday into a Black Friday for the Gryffindor freshmen. Snape is the head of Slytherin House, and they say he favors his own students. The bad news made Ron, the foodie, lose his appetite, looking dejected at the food on the table. Professor Snape. When Ron said this name, images of a man with greasy black hair, a hooked nose, and sallow skin appeared in the minds of both Sherlock and Harry. For Sherlock, it was because of his excellent observation and memory skills. For Harry, there was another reason. Sherlock, Professor Snape was staring at me at the opening ceremony. But just as he was about to tell Sherlock about this and get his opinion, 100 or so owls suddenly flew into the dining hall. Among the flock of delivering owls, a beautiful snowy owl fluttered its wings and landed between Harry's jam pot and sugar bowl, placing a note on his plate. Hedwig. Harry couldn't help but be surprised. So far, this owl, which Hagrid gave him as a birthday present, hadn't brought Harry anything. Unlike Sherlock's Watson, who always manages to bring some surprises from time to time. Hagrid is inviting you to have afternoon tea with him. Sherlock said without looking up. Sherlock, did you learn a spell from Professor Flitwick that allows you to see through paper? After saying this, Ron found it funny himself and couldn't help but laugh. But his laughter stopped as he looked at Harry's expression as he read the note, which seemed to indicate that Sherlock was right. He guessed it again. He couldn't help but mutter. Harry nodded and pushed the note in front of Ron. On it was written in messy handwriting. Dear Harry, I know you have no classes on Friday afternoon. I was wondering if you would like to come over and have tea with me around 3 o'clock? I am very interested to hear about your first week. Please let Hedwig give me a reply. The two couldn't help but look at each other. Although they had witnessed Sherlock's abilities more than once, they were still amazed by his skills whenever a new situation arose. Holy hell! How did you deduce that? Deduce what? That, how did you know that this letter was written by Hagrid and that he was inviting Harry to tea? I don't have time to talk about these trivial matters. Sherlock's tone was not friendly, just like when he treated Hermione on Wednesday night. But just as Ron was about to say something, Sherlock then smiled. Please forgive my rudeness, because you interrupted my train of thought, but it doesn't matter. That is to say, you can't tell that this letter was written by Hagrid to Harry. At least not before opening it. Understanding this is relatively easy, but explaining how I know it is a bit difficult. It's like asking you to prove that 1 + 1 = 2, you can't help but feel a little difficult, but of course you and I both know that this is an undeniable fact. Meeting Harry and Ron's eager to learn gazes, Sherlock thought for a while and decided to explain to them. Just now, I saw Hedwig flying towards you from across several tables with a note tied to her leg, which of course means that someone wrote you a letter. The Dursleys wouldn't write you letters normally. As a freshman, you don't know many people at the magic school. Most of them are students who usually eat and have classes together, and they wouldn't contact you by owl. Hedwig always asks you for a piece of toast every time she comes, but not today, obviously she is already full. Someone who has the conditions to feed her, has a relationship with you at school, and needs to use an owl to send a letter. I can only think of Mr. Rubius Hagrid who meets these 3 conditions at the same time. As for the content of the letter, it is also easy to guess. As a good friend who sent you to school in the first place, it is only natural to want to know about your first week. Plus, we only have this afternoon free this week, so based on these circumstances, I believe that Hagrid is inviting you to have afternoon tea. Too wonderful! Too amazing! Harry and Ron couldn't help but exclaim, attracting sidelong glances from the people nearby. Chapter 29. Actually, it's no big deal. Seeing the surprised and sincerely admiring expressions on Harry and Ron's faces, Sherlock felt happy despite saying that. Even though he was much more mature than his peers, he was still an 11-year-old child after all. Most importantly, he could tell that Harry and Ron's praise was genuine. Unlike those guys he had met before. After recovering from his shock, Ron asked Harry to take him to see Hagrid. Harry didn't refuse and immediately invited Sherlock to come along with anticipation. Sherlock naturally agreed. This was precisely his original intention in approaching Harry, using the savior of the magical world as a fulcrum to interact with all kinds of people and gain a high initial favorability. This way, he could obtain a lot of information without spending too much effort. However, in the process of interacting with Harry, he found that he liked the little boy very much and gradually regarded him as his friend. Precisely because they were friends, he couldn't be ambiguous when it was time to use him. Harry was in a great mood after receiving Sherlock's agreement, and even forgot his worries about potions class and Snape. But he quickly remembered again. Because the potions classroom was located underground, the dim environment inevitably reminded people of the leaky cauldron. However, the truth was that it was even colder and more gloomy than the bar. Various grotesque and strangely shaped animal specimens were placed along the walls, making people feel eerie and terrifying just by looking at them. But compared to the professor of this course, they could even be called handsome and beautiful. The potions professor was Professor Severus Snape, also the last head of the Four Houses. As soon as he opened his mouth, a strange and sarcastic feeling rushed towards them. Harry Potter, oh yes, this is our new famous figure. The Slytherin students immediately sneered. Harry and Ron's faces turned red. Sherlock's eyes lit up when he heard this. He leaned forward, his eyes flashing with excitement. This professor has a lot of spirit. After calling the roll, Snape, like Professor McGonagall, gave all the students a stern warning. You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making. As there is little foolish wand waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you will really appreciate the beauty of the cauldron smoking with white fumes, the delicate power of liquids creeping through human veins, bewitching the mind, ensnaring the senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stopper death if you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach. After saying this, the classroom became silent in an instant. Sherlock nodded in agreement. He thought Snape was absolutely right. In many cases, he had similar feelings. Some people could really lower the IQ of the entire street, and even their appearance in his sight would hurt his eyes. What's even more interesting is that he mentioned science. This was the first professor to mention it in a magic school. In Sherlock's opinion, this one was actually more suitable as the defense against the dark arts professor. If he could be exchanged with Quirrell, it would be a perfect move. Unfortunately, it couldn't be done. However, Sherlock glanced at Harry. Was Snape targeting this savior? With all the teachers, including the somewhat strange Professor Quirrell and the stern Professor McGonagall, liking Harry very much, the sudden appearance of such an anomaly was really an interesting thing to say the least. This scene was so delightful that Sherlock simply played the role of a bystander, watching Harry being harassed by Snape. Potter, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? As soon as Snape asked the question, Hermione raised her hand high. Obviously, she was eager to prove that she was not the kind of idiot Snape was talking about. As for Harry, Sherlock knew from his bewildered expression that this poor child and Ron next to him hadn't even heard the question clearly. Sure enough, Harry answered truthfully, I don't know, sir. Tisk, tisk, you haven't even turned a page of the book before the start of school, have you? Snape didn't hide his contempt. Okay, let's try again. Where would you look if I told you to find me a bezoar? Harry. What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? Harry. It seems that fame doesn't represent everything. Snape began to mock again. Right, the remarkable Mr. Potter. Harry. Faced with Snape's sinister gaze and the undisguised mocking gazes of the Slytherin students, Harry was ashamed and angry, and finally couldn't help but retort. Although I don't know, sir, I think Granger knows the answer, why don't you ask her? This time, someone finally couldn't help but laugh. But as Snape's gaze swept over, the classroom was instantly silent, so quiet that even a needle dropping on the ground could be heard. Sherlock raised his eyebrows. He naturally knew the answers to these questions. Phyllidospores 1000 magical herbs and fungi recorded it, and Arsenius Jigger's magical drafts and potions also mentioned it. Both of these are textbooks on the reading list. But for most people, even if they read the books before the start of school, they wouldn't memorize these contents. Of course, if he didn't think this knowledge was useful, Sherlock wouldn't put it in his brain either. It takes up too much space. Hermione played as stable as always after Harry took the initiative to recommend her. She had already stood up with her hand raised. So why was Snape targeting Harry? Sherlock keenly felt that Snape's malice was directed at Harry, but the source was not Harry himself. Combining Snape's age and identity, an idea had gradually begun to take shape in his mind. Hee. Sherlock laughed. Interesting, too interesting. Unexpectedly, in addition to magic, the teachers of Hogwarts themselves were also very interesting. It was just that the classroom was in a state of silence because of Snape's shock just now, which made his chuckles particularly conspicuous. Sit down. Snape first turned his head and shouted angrily at Hermione, then walked up to Sherlock and stared at him coldly. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, a genius of transfiguration, several professors have praised you. It seems you think this is very funny. It's not like that, sir, it's just. I remembered something happy. Sherlock stood up and replied politely. Chapter 30. Potions Class. All the Gryffindor students looked at Sherlock with concern. They all knew that Snape was unreasonable, biased towards Slytherin, and targeted Gryffindor. Especially today, his attitude towards Harry Potter was a blatant display of this. But they didn't expect that besides Harry, Sherlock would also provoke him. What's so happy about? Snape looked down at Sherlock condescendingly and asked coldly. Isn't it a happy thing to be able to learn the precise science and strict craftsmanship of potions from such an excellent professor? Harry. Ron. Hermione. Little lions, little snakes. Sherlock would actually say such a thing. Too shocking. Snape obviously didn't expect Sherlock to give such an answer. He was stunned for a moment, then said coldly. Holmes, don't try to be clever in front of me. I'm not one of those fools who gets complacent after being praised a few times by you. I'm sorry for making you misunderstand, but I'm indeed telling the truth. Looking at Holmes' calm face as he met his gaze, his words were earnest and sincere, making Snape feel like he had punched cotton. Since you love learning so much, I suppose you know the answers to those questions, right? His words immediately made all the little lions sweat. Although Sherlock's performance in the previous few classes was very impressive, he was very poor in the astronomy class the night before yesterday, which inevitably made people worry. The little snakes had a gloating look on their faces. As long as they see Gryffindor unhappy, they are happy. Sherlock still had a calm face, and said at a constant speed in a tone without any emotion. Powdered root of asphodel mixed with an infusion of wormwood makes a sleeping potion. To find a bezoar, you need to go to the stomach of a goat. Monkshood and wolfsbane are the same plant, there is no difference. The main point is that I say whatever you ask. He didn't mention these knowledge points again, such as the alias of the sleeping potion being draught of living death, bezoar having extremely strong detoxification effects, and monkshood and wolfsbane being collectively called aconite. However, when Snape mentioned the first question to Harry just now, there was a hint of torment and struggle in his expression. Although it was subtle and fleeting, it didn't escape Sherlock's eyes. So Sherlock decided to test it out. He stared at Snape with bright eyes, and said with a try-it-out mentality. The asphodel is a type of lily, and in the language of flowers passed down from the Victorian era, it represents my regrets follow you to the grave. Wormwood represents absence and bitter sorrow. The sleeping potion is a draught of living death, representing a hellish and miserable life. In summary. Enough. Whether it was the little lions or the little snakes, who were listening with great interest, a roar suddenly interrupted Sherlock's description. The already cold classroom seemed to drop several degrees at this moment. Snape's originally gloomy face was now as if it was about to drip water, and his cold and empty eyes wished he could gouge 2 holes in Sherlock. Put away your self-righteous explanation, this is potions class. I really suspect that your brain has been hit by a troll's club, or directly stuffed with a bezoar. Because of your cleverness and those useless explanations, Gryffindor loses 1 point. Sherlock smiled. He had gotten the answer he wanted. Then he caused trouble again. What are you laughing at? I thought of. Before Sherlock could answer, Snape interrupted him directly, disrespecting the class. Gryffindor loses another point. Professor, that's not fair. Hermione, who had been, finally couldn't help it. She, who had been ordered to sit down, stood up. Holmes clearly answered all the questions correctly. That's typical Gryffindor, questioning the professor is a tradition, right? Snape immediately turned his head. What's your name? Hermione Granger. Very well, because you are rude in class and openly contradict the professor, Gryffindor loses 1 point. Hermione. And you, Potter, you can't even answer such a simple question, and you try to direct the professor to do things, Gryffindor loses 3 points. Harry. When he heard that he was being deducted points, Harry was stunned. What does it have to do with me? Also, why am I deducted the most? He was about to speak when Ron kicked him behind the cauldron. Don't talk, he whispered, you don't want Gryffindor to be deducted points again because of you, do you? Harry. The points deduction ended, and the potions class continued. The students worked in pairs to learn how to brew a simple potion to cure boils. Of course, the Gryffindor students' situation did not improve. Almost all the students were criticized one by one, only Malfoy was spared. As for Harry and Sherlock, they were given special attention. The former was because Snape himself looked at him with prejudice. The latter was because of the lily flower language explanation. However, Sherlock's operation was impeccable, and Harry was carried by a big shot, so there was no problem. Snape tried several times to find fault, but all failed. Fortunately, he didn't deduct points from other Gryffindor students, which made the little lion secretly relieved. At this critical moment, Neville, who was next to Sherlock and Harry, had a problem. I don't know what he did, but he burned through the cauldron with Seamus, and the potion inside splashed on the slate floor, burning holes in the shoes of nearby students. A stream of acidic green smoke came out, followed by a loud hiss. Idiot! Snape roared loudly, and was about to deal with it when Sherlock had already picked up his wand. Scour Jiffy! Snape's eyes lit up at the clean and neat movements, but his face turned cold in an instant. He yelled at Neville. I think you probably put the porcupine quills in without taking the cauldron off the fire, didn't you? How could Neville care about answering? He was soaked in potion when the cauldron was knocked over, and now he was covered in red and swollen boils. He was already in pain, and he cried out under Snape's power. Take him to the hospital upstairs. Snape said sharply to Seamus, then turned to Sherlock and Harry. Potter, why didn't you tell him not to add the porcupine quills? Do you think it will make you look good if he makes a mistake? Gryffindor loses 1 point. Harry. And you, Holmes, since you can use magic to clean the floor, why didn't you prevent him from knocking over the cauldron in advance? Gryffindor lost another point because of you. Chapter 31. When Neville heard Snape deducting points from Gryffindor, he forgot his fear and couldn't leave. He was the one who made the mistake, so why were Sherlock and Harry being penalized? The Gryffindor students were stunned. This kind of targeting couldn't just be called obvious, it was blatant and insane. Fortunately, near the end of class, the potion mainly concocted by Sherlock was successful, preventing Snape from finding another opportunity to deduct points. Harry and the others breathed a sigh of relief. Finally, it was over. But at that moment, Sherlock walked towards Snape. Harry was startled. Sherlock, what are you doing? Sherlock smiled slightly. Going to ask Professor Snape for some advice. At that moment, Harry, Ron, Hermione, and all the Gryffindor students shouted in their hearts. No. Don't go. Holmes. Looking at Sherlock approaching him, Snape's gaze became dangerous. What else do you want? I have a few questions I'd like to ask you, Professor. Upon hearing this, Snape was taken aback, then squeezed out a sentence through his teeth. If you're going to ask about some idiotic flower language or something, you'd better shut your annoying mouth. His cold gaze was almost tangible, as if it could pierce through Sherlock. If Neville were here, he would probably be crying by now. Harry, Ron, and the others were not much better. Snape's aura was too strong at the moment, making it feel like he would pull out his wand and cast a spell at any second. However, Sherlock was not affected at all. He looked into Snape's eyes and said calmly, "There are a few questions about potions." Without waiting for Snape to agree, he directly stated the questions he had summarized. Hearing Sherlock's questions, Snape was even more surprised than before. For a first-year student, asking these questions was not easy. It was even more difficult than successfully answering the questions he had posed in class. These questions aptly pointed out the key difficulties of first-year potions, playing a crucial role in outlining, connecting, and summarizing. Although Snape had always wanted to be the defense against the dark arts teacher, he was also a true potions master. Through Sherlock's questions, he knew that the other party already had a comprehensive and systematic understanding of the potions course. His gaze instantly softened. This talent surpassed even hers back then, and she was also a Gryffindor. Thinking of that person, the beautiful face with red hair and green eyes appeared in his mind. After answering Sherlock's questions, Snape looked at Sherlock's grey eyes and said coldly, "Holmes, if you want to achieve something in potions, you'd better stay away from Potter." After saying these words, he glanced at the wall behind Sherlock, turned around with a flourish, and left gracefully, like a black bat. Watching Snape leave, Sherlock said without turning his head, "Come out. Harry, Hermione, Ron." The trio behind the wall slowly came out, and Harry was a little embarrassed. "Sherlock, when did you find out we were there?" "From the moment you started following me." "Hey!" Ron looked surprised. "I thought you only knew after we hid here." "I have some confidence in tracking and counter-tracking. By the way, Professor Snape noticed you a long time ago." "I knew it." Hermione was a little excited. "He must have been looking at us when he left, right?" Sherlock nodded. "Obviously." Because of Hermione's righteous words for Sherlock in potions class, Harry, who was originally indifferent to him, and Ron, who was originally disgusted with her, both gained a lot of goodwill. Coupled with the shared concern for Sherlock, the three followed Sherlock. Fortunately, Snape didn't make things difficult for Sherlock. But his last sentence inevitably made people feel a little indignant. What does it mean to stay away from Potter if you want to achieve something in potions? Harry doesn't have Veela blood, so how could he affect Sherlock's studies? Harry himself felt even worse. In the first week of school, Gryffindor had 4 points deducted because of him in just one potions class, as many as Sherlock and Granger combined. Strictly speaking, Sherlock and Granger were deducted points because of him. This made him feel even more depressed. He really didn't understand why Snape hated him so much. Just then, a hand was placed on his shoulder. Harry looked up and saw Sherlock's grey eyes. Sherlock said calmly, "Deduction of points is not a big deal." He really didn't care about the deduction of points. Not to mention 1 or 2 points, even 8 or 10, 100 or 200, he wouldn't even frown. Ron nodded repeatedly. "That's right, George and Fred are often deducted points. Don't be affected by this, we're going to find Hagrid later." Hearing Ron mention this, Harry finally cheered up. Sherlock turned to Hermione at this time. "Want to come along?" Hermione was stunned. "Hagrid? Who's that?" "He's the big guy who took us all the way from the train station to the castle." "How about it, want to come along?" After changing his opinion of Hermione, Ron also took the initiative to explain. Hermione suddenly understood, but after looking at the three of them, she thought for a moment and shook her head. "No, I have to go to the library to look up information." If it were just Sherlock alone, she might consider it. Both came from Muggle families and knew each other before school started. Judging from the classes this week, he, like herself, is a good student who loves to learn, and must have a lot in common. Although his performance in astronomy is not good, it is acceptable. But her relationship with Harry and Ron can only be considered as classmates, not good enough to get together. Even if the other party is the savior of the wizarding world. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Sherlock took Harry and Ron to Hagrid's hut on time. On the way, they also encountered the caretaker Argus Filch and his cat, Mrs. Norris. Filch tried to find evidence of them violating school rules, but with Sherlock around, he naturally failed. But the look in his eyes when he left was full of warning. "Don't let me catch you." That's probably what he meant. Sherlock's gaze stared at Mrs. Norris, who was walking away with Filch. To explore the campus, Peeves and Filch are unavoidable. From Filch's performance, it is not difficult to see that he attaches great importance to Mrs. Norris. When he saw that the pet cat was thin and grey, he couldn't help but have a bold idea. Chapter 32. Rubeus Hagrid was the keeper of keys and grounds at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and also Harry Potter's first true friend. He lived in a wooden cabin on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. When Sherlock, Harry, and Ron arrived at the cabin door, Sherlock's eyes scanned a crossbow and a pair of rubber overshoes, giving him a preliminary assessment of the man's character. If he could examine them closely, he could discover even more. But there was no need. As Harry began to knock, barking and Hagrid's scolding voice rang out in succession. Then the door of the small cabin was opened. "Wait a minute." Hagrid opened the door a crack, while turning back to scold, "Back, Fang, back." He struggled to hold onto the collar of a huge black boarhound to keep it from jumping out, finally managing to let the three into the house. This cabin, unlike Hogwarts Castle, was not enhanced with spatial magic. Small on the outside, small on the inside as well. Hams and pheasants hung from the ceiling, a copper kettle boiled on the hearth, and a huge wooden table and chairs sat in front of the fireplace. A large bed was in the corner of the room, covered with a patchwork quilt. In Harry and Ron's eyes, that was all there was to it. But in Sherlock's eyes, Hagrid's cabin was simply a golden house shimmering with dazzling light. This also proved that his prediction was completely correct. Even without carefully examining the crossbow and shoes at the door, the things inside were enough for him to make a judgment about Hagrid. Yes, indeed a person worth befriending. At this moment, Hagrid had released the large dog named Fang, and once freed, it immediately pounced on the three of them. Due to its size, Harry and Ron were startled and instinctively retreated. Sherlock reacted much faster than they did. He saw through the dog's nature at a glance. So, the moment he saw Hagrid release the collar, he subtly took a step back, shielding Ron behind him. In Ron's horrified gaze, Fang climbed to the level of Ron's neck and began to lick his ears. Seeing the ferocious dog instantly turn into a licking dog, Harry and Ron were stunned, not knowing what to say. Sherlock spoke at just the right moment. "The dog is like its master. Fang, like its owner, is obviously not as fierce as it looks." Hagrid. If he hadn't misunderstood, was this a compliment? But, why did it sound so strange? However, Hagrid was a straightforward person after all, so he simply stopped thinking about it since he couldn't figure it out. At this time, Harry had also introduced Sherlock and Ron to Hagrid. Hagrid, while putting his newly made rock cakes on a plate, looked at Ron's freckled face and said, "Another Weasley, eh? I've spent most of my life trying to keep those twins out of the Forbidden Forest." After saying this slightly exaggerated joke, he turned to Sherlock, a Muggle-born genius wizard. "I heard several professors speak highly of you. Sherlock is amazing." Harry's affection for Hagrid was obvious. After all, in Harry's eyes, this big guy was the one who brought him into the magical world, thus changing his life. On the other hand, he had been suppressed too much in potions class. So at this moment, Harry seemed very excited, talking to Hagrid at length about Sherlock's unique observation and reasoning skills, and praising the deductive method to the highest degree. His words inevitably contained the idea of showing off his excellent good friend. Hagrid was initially listening with great interest. After all, it was a good thing that Harry could make friends in a new environment. However, because Harry was too complimentary of Sherlock in his words, he gradually began to think that Harry was exaggerating, overstating some of Sherlock's petty skills. As the person who had personally rescued baby Harry from the wreckage of the house, sent him to the Dursleys, and personally picked him up this year, Hagrid felt that he had to test Harry. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he looked at Sherlock with great interest, forcing a smile, "since Harry speaks so highly of you, I wonder if you can deduce something from me." Harry and Ron, hearing this, immediately leaned forward. I'm afraid I can't deduce much," Sherlock said honestly. "You don't like your mother." As soon as he finished speaking, the smile on Hagrid's face instantly disappeared, and he stared at Sherlock in shock. After a brief silence, he said, "Although I don't remember her much, she really wasn't a good mother, but how did you know?" "It's really not worth mentioning." Sherlock shrugged. "There is a photo of you and your father on the bedside table. Although it's very old, it's spotless, but the rest of the room is messy, which shows that you are a person who values family affection. From your father's size, it can be seen that he is not a giant, so I guess you should be a half-giant according to my knowledge. The taller the giant, the more say they have. 12 feet tall is already considered short among giants. There is no your mother in the photo, plus this tradition, so I expect your mother left when you were a child, and your father raised you alone." "You guessed right." Hagrid took a deep breath, as if somewhat unconvinced, and asked, "Anything else?" You like animals very much and know their habits very well. You guessed that too. How did you know? Did you see it from Fang? No, Sherlock's eyes swept across the room. I saw it from your cabin, a doghouse made of unicorn hair and umbrella flower petals, a wind chime made of rainbow fish scales, a tablecloth sewn from flitterby skin, a carpet woven from puff skein fluff. Sherlock's words made Harry and Ron widen their eyes. They didn't know about other materials, but unicorn hair, just one strand costs 10 galleons. The fragrant umbrella flower petals are also not cheap, costing at least 5 galleons. In other words, this seemingly messy doghouse is worth thousands of galleons. And from Sherlock's description, other items must also be expensive. At this moment, they looked back at Hagrid's cabin. How could it be called simple? It was clearly a golden house glittering enough to blind a dog's eyes. Harry was okay, but Ron instantly didn't want to work hard anymore. Study? Screw studying. Studying hard for 7 years is not as good as being a gamekeeper and keeper of keys. Chapter 33. Amazing, you can identify so many materials. Hearing Sherlock's description, Hagrid's eyes grew brighter and brighter. What else do you see? From the calluses on your hands, you've done a lot of digging. I've been a gamekeeper for over 40 years, it's my job. You often cook for yourself and enjoy it. That's not bad. You like to drink mead. Absolutely correct. You were entrusted to retrieve something important from Gringotts Wizarding Bank. After you retrieved it, someone broke in illegally to steal it. But because you were one step ahead, the theft was unsuccessful. Also, although you think the place where you are keeping it now is safe, you're still very concerned about it. Hagrid suddenly stood up, the chair falling to the ground with a loud bang because of the sudden movement. But he was completely unaware at this moment, his eyes were wide like copper bells, pointing at Sherlock, and after a long while, he suddenly realized as if he had found the truth. Harry told you, didn't he? Harry was about to deny it, but Sherlock shook his head. No, actually this is simpler than the previous speculation. As he said that, he reached out and pulled out a small piece of paper pressed under the teapot warmer. It was a report clipped from the Daily Prophet. The title above was Latest Report on Illegal Intrusion at Gringotts. Hagrid was speechless upon seeing this. Instead, Harry couldn't help but exclaim, that day was my birthday. Hagrid, it's very likely we were there when it happened. Hagrid took a deep breath, rubbed his nose and said, Mr. Holmes, Harry is right, your reasoning ability is too amazing, it's exactly as you said. But, we don't need to talk about it now, let's try my rock cakes first. He stiffly changed the subject while enthusiastically handing out food to the three of them. Just like Sherlock said, he was very passionate about cooking. It's just that his cooking skills were disastrous. It's not an exaggeration to say that the rock cakes almost broke Harry and Ron's teeth. Out of politeness, Harry and Ron could only try to pretend that they loved eating them. As for Sherlock, after trying to squeeze the rock cake with force, his eyes lit up. Then he directly asked Hagrid to pack them up to take away. Hagrid was a little doubtful when he saw that Sherlock didn't eat the cake, but he was extremely happy when he heard this request and hurriedly agreed. As a result, when the three of them left, their pockets were full and heavy. I don't understand. Even a foodie like Ron was a little skeptical about life because of the rock cakes at this moment. Sherlock, why did you bring them? You can't even bite them. As he said that, he took out a cake and smashed it to the side. There was a cracking sound, and a branch broke. As for the rock cake, naturally, it was unharmed. That's because your understanding of it is biased. Sherlock reached out and knocked on his head. You have to try to change your thinking, don't treat it as food, but treat it as equipment, then this thing will become very practical. Harry. Ron. The two didn't take it seriously, thinking Sherlock was just joking. After all, this was just a small episode. Harry was most concerned about the Gringotts Wizarding Bank incident. So he simply described to Sherlock in detail how Hagrid took a small package from Vault 713 in Gringotts before taking him to withdraw money. Now he has gradually developed the habit of asking Sherlock whenever he encounters problems. After getting more detailed information from Harry, Sherlock nodded. As I expected, Hagrid was entrusted. Dumbledore thought Gringotts was not safe enough, so he wanted to transfer the location. Now it seems Dumbledore was right. If we were any later, that thing might have been snatched by the robbers. Ron couldn't help but say, congratulating himself for having such a visionary and wise headmaster. No, that's just your subjective conjecture. Sherlock pointed out his loophole mercilessly. According to Harry's experience and Hagrid's statement, Gringotts' safety factor is no lower than Hogwarts. Even if that thing was not taken away by Hagrid, that person may not be able to leave safely with it. Just as Ron was about to refute, Sherlock said again, of course, this is just a possibility, maybe that person can really break through Gringotts' defense. After all, he is still at large so far. Sherlock, don't you want to catch him? Harry asked anxiously. Bringing every criminal to justice has always been my interest, but now it seems it will be difficult to achieve. Why? You can definitely do it with your ability. Harry asked in confusion. Oh, my dear friend, Sherlock looked at the savior of the wizarding world, and as expected, he saw clear stupidity in his eyes. I'm glad you trust me so much, but neither Gringotts Wizarding Bank nor the Ministry of Magic would ask a first-year student from a magic school to investigate such a theft case. Harry was speechless upon hearing this. Yes, Sherlock is only 11 years old after all, who would do this except those who have truly seen his abilities? Even Hagrid, who trusted him so much, was still thinking about testing him after hearing Sherlock's description, wasn't he? Looking at Harry, who was in a heavy mood, Sherlock didn't say anything more. In fact, if he really wanted to investigate this case, there were still ways. With Hagrid's personality, it was not difficult to get information from his mouth. What's more, there was also Dumbledore. But compared to this case, there are more attractive things to Sherlock now. A whole new world. For him, who has always believed in science, the attraction of magic is too great. Moreover, this is the magic world, the Ministry of Magic can't be like Scotland Yard, right? Sherlock shook his head and threw this ridiculous idea out of his mind. Time always slips away quietly without knowing it. It has been a month since Sherlock came to Hogwarts. Besides class, his time is almost all devoted to several professors. Of course, only the courses he finds useful. He only listens to the parts of the history of magic that he finds useful, and occasionally asks Professor Binns questions. As for Professor Quirrell's defense against the dark arts class, he simply asked for leave and didn't go to class after listening for 2 weeks. Anyway, listening to his lectures is no different from reading the textbook himself, it's just a waste of time. Chapter 34. Sherlock's skipping of the defense against the dark arts class made Harry and Ron very envious. They wanted to as well, but didn't dare. After all, skipping class would result in warnings, deductions of points, and even detention. Even the mischievous Weasley twins didn't dare to do such a thing openly. Faced with his two friends' worries, Sherlock didn't care at all. Anyway, it was only one class a week, and he had already fooled his way through the first class with a leave of absence. If Quirrell wanted to deduct points next time, he could get them back from other professors. When it really came to the point of being given detention, he would still have ways to deal with it. Compared to the subject-selective Sherlock, Hermione Granger was undoubtedly a model student in the eyes of all the teachers. Never late, and even less likely to be absent. She would preview every class in advance, listen attentively in class, actively answer questions, and diligently complete her homework. Even the boring history of magic and defense against the dark arts were no exception. This was her difference from Sherlock. However, the two also had something in common, which was that they would both immerse themselves in the library every weekend. Sherlock consulted materials in order to better understand the magical world. The books in Diagon Alley were too expensive, and now that he had a free channel, he naturally wouldn't let it go. Hermione was there for her class assignments. The two had known each other before the start of school, and now that they had such an opportunity, their relationship naturally became more and more familiar. Sherlock even discovered in the process of getting along that Hermione was surprisingly useful. In addition to discussing coursework itself, Hermione could also help him find information. During the sorting, Sherlock had learned from the Sorting Hat that Ravenclaw had many knowledge-based type talents, but after the start of school, he had been addicted to magic and had no time to pay attention to them. He never expected that the knowledge base would be right beside him. The most typical example was that he finally knew why Voldemort wanted to deal with Harry. Hermione found a piece of inside information. At that time, Voldemort had heard a prophecy. Despite being asked to keep it a secret, the content of the prophecy still spread after Voldemort's death. The person who could end the Dark Lord's rule would be born at the end of July in a wizarding family. Harry was precisely the person who met the conditions. Although it was inside information, judging from the results, this prophecy was very accurate. There were other things as well that made Sherlock feel that Hermione was becoming more and more useful. I won't go into details here. In short, the behavior of the two of them formed a stark contrast with the other little lions who were immersed in adventure. This also made people wonder if the Sorting Hat had made a mistake, and that people like them should have gone to Ravenclaw. One day, Hermione woke Sherlock, who was immersed in the ocean of knowledge, as usual. "Holmes, we have to go, the library is closing." "Thank you, Miss Granger." Hermione originally thought she was a serious person, but since getting to know Holmes, she had begun to feel inferior. The other party could hold a book and read it all day long, not to mention eating and going to the bathroom. He didn't even need to change his posture. The two of them walked out of the library side by side. As they walked, Sherlock suddenly turned to Hermione and said, "Okay." Hermione was startled. "What are you talking about? What's okay? Didn't you have something to ask me?" "I said it's okay." "How did you know?" Hermione was taken aback. She did indeed have something she wanted to say to Sherlock. But she hadn't even opened her mouth. "Miss Granger, you may not believe it, but such things are very obvious to me. Explanation is just a waste of time, so I suggest you just ask your question directly." Looking at Sherlock's somewhat impatient look, Hermione couldn't help but feel a little annoyed. But Sherlock was indeed right, so she took a deep breath and asked the question that had been bothering her for a long time. "Back then, in the Leaky Cauldron, how did you know my parents were dentists?" "That's it." Seeing Hermione gnashing her teeth, Sherlock smiled. "Okay, let's just take it as a thank you for reminding me every time that the library is about to close. You already know that I have always developed the habit of inferring through observation, or rather, it is an ability to analyze things using intuition, so when I come to a conclusion, I am not aware of the steps to reach the conclusion. But when you asked, I realized that there were certain steps involved." Hermione looked at Sherlock intently, waiting for him to continue. "First of all, from the way your family dressed, I could infer that you had a good income. Secondly, your parents' posture was very special when they were discussing that Hogwarts letter, which shows that they have the demeanor of medical workers. High income plus this characteristic obviously indicates that they are both doctors. Also, when they were talking to my parents, they unconsciously observed my parents' mouths more than once. This professional habit is difficult to hide, so I deduced that they should be dentists." This series of thoughts took less than a second, so I blurted it out. "I remember your parents were very surprised at the time." After saying this, Hermione's small mouth was slightly open, and she looked at Sherlock in surprise, not knowing what to do for a moment. Every weekend since the start of school, she had been soaking in the library with Sherlock, and the long time spent together had given her a certain understanding of Sherlock's reasoning ability. But when she heard Sherlock say in one breath the process of judging her parents' identities, Hermione was still stunned. After a long while, she came back to her senses and said to Sherlock admiringly, "Listening to your explanation, things seem to become particularly simple. I didn't believe it when Potter and the Weasleys mentioned it before, but I didn't expect that there would really be someone in the world like Dupin in Edgar Allan Poe's novels." Sherlock turned his head when he heard this and stared at Hermione with intriguing eyes. The little girl obviously couldn't stand this sharp gaze and asked a little uncomfortably, "What's wrong? You must think that comparing me to Dupin is a compliment to me." Sherlock sneered, "But in my opinion, he is not worthy of praise every time he has to be silent for a quarter of an hour before suddenly revealing his friend's thoughts. This trick is really superficial. Of course, he does have some analytical talent, but he is by no means the extraordinary character that Edgar Allan Poe imagined." Hermione. Sherlock was right. She had indeed thought that comparing this first detective in detective novel history to Sherlock was elevating the other party, but she didn't expect that she would be despised. Hermione was unconvinced and couldn't help but ask again, "You must have read Agatha's works, right? What do you think of Poirot?" Chapter 35. Hearing Hermione mention Poirot, Sherlock's disdain lessened slightly. Poirot can be considered a true detective. His reasoning ability is much stronger than Dupin's. He can solve some cases using only his brain, and his reasoning process can be called meticulous. However, he doesn't like going into the field. Helpless, he can only rely on the police to present the facts to him on a platter, and then analyze these facts with his so-called little grey cells. Once the police bring something that isn't a fact, his inability to personally search for clues will mislead him, causing him to make inferences that don't match the truth. But he always manages to find the culprit. Hearing Sherlock belittle both of her admired figures, Hermione couldn't help but retort. "My dear Miss Granger, because this is fiction." Facing Hermione's questioning, Sherlock smiled. As the author, Agatha Christie, of course, can ensure that Poirot's intuition is always correct. The same goes for Miss Marple in her books, but that may not be the case in real life. By the way, like most popular fiction writers, this author likes to pile up settings and detailed descriptions, but neglects the real core of the novel, a wonderful plot and distinctive characters. This way, whenever the reasoning is too long, it becomes boring. Readers will lose patience while reading and just want the culprit to appear as soon as possible. Only people like me care about the reasoning process itself. Unfortunately, I can't be considered a normal person. Hearing Sherlock look down on the two characters she admired, Hermione was initially a little angry. But when she heard his evaluation of himself, she suddenly felt that she didn't need to be angry. Saying he's not normal, he even scolds himself when he gets mad, so what's there to be angry about? Although she said she wasn't angry anymore, she didn't talk to Sherlock anymore. She didn't speak, and Sherlock didn't take the initiative to speak. Just like that, the two of them walked back in silence, which was a kind of unexpected tacit understanding. Until they arrived at the Gryffindor common room and saw a notice posted on the bulletin board. A month after the start of school, flying class was finally about to begin. Only first-year students have this class, which takes place on Thursday afternoons after Charms class. The instructor is Rolanda Hooch, and the content is learning how to use a broomstick. We have to take classes with the Slytherin students again. Hermione frowned upon seeing the notice. Why do they always put us together with them? Don't be prejudiced against that house. Compared to the dissatisfied Hermione, Sherlock was much calmer. The four houses are not superior or inferior. Headmaster Severus Snape is also an excellent professor. Are you sure? Hermione looked shocked. You really think Professor Snape is a good person? Although I think it's somewhat one-sided to evaluate a person simply as good or bad, if you mean it that way, Professor Snape is indeed a good person. He's been targeting you and Potter like that, and you still think he's a good person? Hermione now truly felt that Sherlock was right, he really wasn't normal. From the perspective of a professor, there's nothing wrong with what he does. Deducting points is originally his right. As for targeting, Sherlock smiled. Miss Granger, you might not believe it, but he may indeed be the person in this school who least wants anything to happen to Harry. Hermione. After a moment of silence, Hermione sighed deeply. You're happy, that's all, but I don't think Potter himself would think so. To be honest, his opinion is not important. Yet, Snape has already deducted 30 points from him this month, more than twice the total of everyone else in Gryffindor. Speaking of this, Hermione couldn't help but laugh. Poor Harry Potter, the savior status that is highly praised by others seems to have lost its effect on Snape. After discussing it for a while, realizing that she couldn't convince Sherlock, Hermione had no choice but to return to the girls' dormitory. But before leaving, she once again showed a hesitant expression. Sherlock, Miss Granger, if you have something to say, just say it. Hermione took a deep breath. Can you just call me Hermione from now on? Sherlock was slightly stunned, then nodded. Of course. After Hermione left, Sherlock shook his head. Changing the way you address someone from their last name to their first name, isn't that a natural thing that happens after a close relationship? Was it necessary to bring it up specifically? And with that hesitant tone? Sure enough, what father said is correct, even I sometimes cannot understand the female thought process. The enthusiasm for flying class among the first-year students was much higher than imagined. Most wizarding families started talking about their past flying experiences whenever they had free time. It seemed that they spent most of their childhood flying around in the wilderness on broomsticks. This also included Ron. As long as someone was willing to listen, he would talk about his thrilling story of almost hitting a hang glider while riding Charlie's old broom. This naturally had some exaggeration, but it was much better than Malfoy from the neighboring Slytherin house, who would dangerously brush past helicopters. New students like Sherlock, Harry, and Hermione, who grew up in Muggle families, were also very interested in flying class, but they were not as excited as others. Only Neville was an exception. Others were nervous with excitement, but he was just nervous. Because although he grew up in a wizarding family, his grandmother never let him near a broomstick. Because of this, he always listened intently to every word Hermione said. The latter found some flying instructions from a library book called Quidditch Through the Ages. Sherlock had also read this book, but he didn't think these things were very useful. To fly higher, you certainly can't just rely on reading books. Flying is like driving. These instructions written in books will only work after you have tried them yourself. You know, many people still can't drive even after getting their driver's license. Only by actually driving on the road can you master real driving skills. Finally, Thursday afternoon arrived amidst much anticipation. Compared to the excited classmates, although Sherlock was also looking forward to flying class, he didn't show it so exaggeratedly. He even wanted to ask Professor Flitwick a few more questions at the end of Charms class. But in the end, he left under the repeated urging of the anxious Harry and Ron. Even so, when they and the other Gryffindor students quickly walked down the sloping lawn to the field in front, the Slytherin students were already there. As the little lions arrived, the little snake's eyes immediately turned cold. The little lions, known for their courage, naturally glared back unceremoniously. Gazes met, and a tense atmosphere began to permeate the surroundings. Among them, the eye contact between Harry and Malfoy was the most intense. Sherlock ignored this. His attention was on something further away. Chapter 36. The Quidditch pitches lawn bordered the Forbidden Forest. Since going with Harry to Hagrid's hut and seeing his collection, Sherlock had been filled with interest in the Forbidden Forest. Of course, he was also interested in other parts of Hogwarts. Like the corridor on the right side of the 4th floor. At the start of the term, Dumbledore had specifically said that if anyone wanted to encounter accidents and a painful death, they should go there. Therefore, it and the Forbidden Forest were both areas that Sherlock felt he had to explore. Especially today, with the wind being somewhat boisterous, the dark trees swayed in the wind, exuding endless attraction in Sherlock's eyes. So, the minor disputes between the little lions and snakes were really of no interest to him. Just as the eye contact between the two sides was becoming more and more intense, the person responsible for teaching them to fly arrived late. Madame Rolanda Hooch, the flying instructor, had short, grey, ear-length hair and yellow eyes like a hawk. Sherlock only glanced at her and could already tell what kind of person she was: efficient, a woman of her word, and equally strict with herself and others. Sure enough, Madame Hooch didn't even have an opening speech when she met them, and immediately started teaching. Well, what are you all waiting for? Everyone stand next to a broomstick. Quick, quick, hurry up. Urged by Madame Hooch, all the young wizards quickly took their positions. At this time, she directly began to impart flying skills. Obviously, this teacher intended to let them master the theory on their own through practice. Sherlock was happy to accept this kind of teaching method, it was exactly what he liked. However, the result was not ideal. Sherlock looked around and found that even for a simple introductory operation, only a few people from the two houses could complete it. Among them were Harry and Malfoy. The action seemed simple: extend your right hand and stand on the right side of the broom, shouting, "Up." However, Neville's broom didn't move at all. Ron's did move, but a little too violently, directly hitting him in the nose. These were two extremes. Most people's brooms rolled on the ground, or shook a couple of times, looking like they were both welcoming and rejecting. This included Sherlock and Hermione. When Sherlock looked towards Hermione, Hermione also looked back at him. Sherlock didn't care, but Hermione felt a little embarrassed. After a month of school, Hermione had successfully established her position as a top student among the first years. Originally, Sherlock was a strong competitor. However, since he brought up the common knowledge of the Earth revolving around the Sun in astronomy class, and the matter of skipping defense against the dark arts lessons, in Hermione's view, Sherlock was equivalent to voluntarily giving up. She never expected that she would encounter setbacks in flying class and be seen by Sherlock. Fortunately, Sherlock quickly shifted his gaze. At this time, Hermione also noticed the broom tightly held in Harry's hand. This inevitably made her a little disappointed. Disappointed as she was, considering that the other party was, after all, the savior of the magical world, the person who defeated Voldemort as a baby, it was acceptable for him to be able to do this. On the other hand, when she discovered that Sherlock's broom was just shaking slightly like hers, she couldn't help but show a gratified smile. It seems that academic elites like us are not good at sports. However, the next moment, she was stunned. Because as Sherlock spoke again, the broom steadily landed in his hand. Up. Hermione refused to accept it and spoke again. This time, the broom simply didn't move, not giving her any face. Up. Hermione increased the volume, as if she wanted to make the broom afraid. Unfortunately, it was useless, the broom wasn't afraid. Hermione. There were quite a few people like Hermione. Whether they raised the decibels or changed their posture, the brooms refused to cooperate. Madame Hooch, with many years of teaching experience, was used to this situation. At this time, her rich teaching experience came in handy. She stepped forward to demonstrate one by one, and with her personal instruction, after half an hour, all the young wizards finally mastered the trick of making the broom listen. Next, Hooch began to demonstrate how to get on the broom, how to prevent slipping off the broom, and the correct gripping method. At this time, Hermione performed very well and received encouragement from Hooch. In contrast, Malfoy, who claimed to be very good, was constantly criticized for doing it wrong, and Harry and Ron showed their happiness on their faces. He said he was so good, Ron said disdainfully, I knew he was bragging. Harry nodded repeatedly. Sherlock shook his head, no, he should indeed fly well. Hey! Why? Ron expressed his doubts, while Harry skipped this step and directly began to ask for the reason. After knowing Sherlock for a month, he had a strong feeling that as long as Sherlock started reasoning, he would be persuaded. It's very simple, some people who already know how to drive may not do as well as people who have never been exposed to cars when they take a driving test. Sherlock looked at Malfoy, who looked unconvinced, and explained to the two in a calm tone. Years of experience have already formed a set of their own operating habits, although not necessarily the standard answer, but the most suitable for them. Such people may not do as well as a blank slate novice when participating in a qualifying exam. As far as I know, even some professional drivers may have to retake the test repeatedly because they cannot pass the basic subject tests. Harry, Ron. Although they didn't understand what he was saying, they felt like it was very impressive. Finally, the foreplay was over, and it was time to take off. All right, when I blow my whistle, you kick off the ground with both legs, remember, kick hard. Hooch's eyes swept across the field, and she said word by word, hold the broom steady, rise a few feet, then lean forward slightly, and land vertically. For the first test flight, the height naturally had to be within a controllable range. At this moment, everyone was nervous. Some students were even exerting too much force, their knuckles gripping the broom turning slightly white. Sherlock sighed, this was just a waste of effort. If they were going to the battlefield, a detail could very well have determined the victory or defeat. Just then, he glanced and his heart stirred. He moved a few steps to the right rear, and inconspicuously protected a classmate in front of him. Because everyone's attention was on their own broom, no one noticed his actions. Listen to my whistle. 3-2. However, before Hooch could finish counting, an accident occurred. Chapter 37. Madame Hooch's whistle hadn't even sounded, and a figure had already shot out ahead of everyone. Neville Longbottom. The reason he started early was because he had been running into walls ever since the start of the school year, so he had a strong desire deep down. Teacher, I want to improve so badly. In fact, the moment he made that move, he knew he was done for. At that moment, 11 years of experiences flashed through his mind. Am I going to die? I heard that people only recall their life experiences when they are about to die. What a pity. Grandma said I originally had a chance to become the savior. Just when he thought he was doomed. A powerful resistance suddenly came from behind. A pair of strong arms forcibly held him down in an extremely rough manner. It was as if a car that had already been put into first gear, revved up, and just started was suddenly slammed on the brakes. The car stopped in place, the rear wheels spinning. The tail of Neville's broom vibrated at a high frequency, as if unwilling to be conquered in such an unmagical way. However, that was useless. All flying brooms have a summoning charm attached to their surface, but the spell's effect and range are not great. Especially the flying brooms used for class. Just like the training cars for driving, they meet the minimum requirements for economic savings good enough to use. So no matter how hard he struggled, it was in vain. The more he struggled, the more excited the person stopping him from taking off became. That's what makes it interesting. Everyone was stunned by this scene. Sherlock. He actually forcibly pulled back Neville, who was about to take off, with his own strength. Also, why is he so strong? In the contest between the two, the broom finally gave up struggling. As a result, Neville was only one position ahead of the others, and he couldn't fly at all. Merlin's beard. Hooch was the first to react. She shouted the common exclamation of the magic world and ran towards Neville. No one knew better than her what would happen if Neville flew out ahead of time. A person who can't control a flying broom flying into the sky, if lucky, would only break a wrist. If unlucky, it's hard to say what would be broken. While checking Neville's body with lingering fear, she sincerely thanked Sherlock. "Thank you so much. Are you okay, child? The broom's sprinting force is great, but it's not difficult to handle if you are prepared in advance." Sherlock shook his arms and said truthfully, "You're really strong. It's hard to imagine that you, who look so thin, would be so powerful." After confirming that Neville was okay, Hooch, relieved, belatedly asked in surprise, "By the way, how did you see that this child would act in advance? You shouldn't have started divination classes yet, right?" Hearing Hooch's question, all the students pricked up their ears. After all, in the magical world, foreknowledge is too mysterious. After all, the fact that the Savior would end the Dark Lord's rule was foretold through divination. However, the Savior in the prophecy was well aware that this had nothing to do with divination. Sherlock must have judged that Neville would have an accident through some details that others hadn't noticed. Ron and Hermione had the same idea as him. After all, they had seen Sherlock's abilities more than once. Sherlock indeed did not disappoint them. "This has nothing to do with divination." Sherlock pointed at Neville and calmly explained. "People secrete hormones such as adrenaline, dopamine, and cortisol when they are overly nervous. Under their influence, they often do things that are contrary to common sense. Obviously, through some of his actions, I could easily judge this point, so I took emergency measures in advance." Obviously. Madame Hooch couldn't keep up with Sherlock's train of thought for a moment. "Yes, such as the white knuckles gripping the stick, the abnormal rhythm of limb twitching, and the abnormally flushed face. Of course, the most important thing is that I understand this student's personality, so I deduced that there was a high probability that he would take off early because he was worried about being left on the ground." "But how do you know what hormones people secrete when they are nervous?" "Adrenaline, dopamine, cortisol. This is common sense, Madame Hooch." "Hooch? How come I don't know this common sense?" After Sherlock finished speaking, everyone was stunned. Only Harry, Ron, and Hermione showed as expected expressions. Harry looked at Sherlock with admiration. Although it had happened more than once, he would have the same feeling every time something similar happened. Before Sherlock explained, he felt that things were so incredible. After Sherlock explained, it would make people feel that the reasoning was so simple. In any case, Sherlock's actions saved Neville, which made Hooch generously award Gryffindor 6 points. Sherlock was very satisfied, so that he could offset the loss of not attending the 2 Defense Against the Dark Arts classes. After this turmoil, the rest of the flying lesson was normal. Most people performed normally and successfully completed their first test flight mission. Except for Neville. Hooch forbade him from flying in this class. Neville didn't care about this. At this time, he was taking out a glass ball filled with white smoke and said to Hermione, who was also left on the ground, "Grandma knows that I'm always forgetful, so she sent me a remembrall with an L. It will tell you if you've forgotten something. Like this, hold it tightly, and if it turns red, it means you've forgotten something." He stopped when he said this. Because the moment the remembrall was held by him, it suddenly turned bright red. "Neville. Hermione." Neville immediately tried to recall what he had forgotten. Hermione sighed and looked up at the sky. She was not forbidden from flying. It's just that when she was test flying, she suddenly discovered a very helpless thing. She is not good at flying. Although not as bad as Neville, compared to the handy feeling of facing other courses, the flying class was obviously much worse. Especially when flying to a certain height, she didn't dare to look down at all. Otherwise, her legs would tremble, making it impossible to continue. Stubborn, she naturally wouldn't give up like this. Unfortunately, after trying several times, she still couldn't overcome this fear. So she could only return to the ground to rest. Of course, her performance was considered passable by Madame Hooch. But in Hermione's eyes, not getting excellent is a failure. What's more, she can't even reach a good level now, barely passing. Especially. Hermione looked up. It's fine if Harry and Sherlock are stronger than her, but even the Weasleys' redhead and that Seamus who always makes explosions in class look like they're handling it with ease. This made her, who has a strong personality, really unable to bear it. Chapter 38. Hermione was very dissatisfied with her performance in the flying lesson. But the situation was stronger than her. The flying lesson was about to end, and her legs began to tremble again at the thought of flying into the sky again. In this situation, Hermione shook her head helplessly and could only face reality. Let's think of other ways. At this moment, she noticed that Neville, who was next to her, was still holding the Remembrall tightly in his hand, still looking thoughtful, and muttering in a low voice whether he had forgotten to eat lunch, do his homework, fold the quilt, wash clothes, etc., and finally couldn't help but said. Is there a possibility that you forgot to thank Sherlock? That's right. Neville slapped his forehead. The man had saved his life, how could he forget such an important thing? Thank you, Granger. I'm going to thank Holmes now. Watching Neville trot towards Sherlock, who had just landed from the sky, Hermione's heart suddenly moved, and a bold idea sprouted in her mind. After the flying lesson, the students came to the dining hall for dinner as usual. Every time it was mealtime, Ron Weasley would transform into a rice bucket. At this moment, he was picking up a steak and kidney pie and putting it in his mouth, his eyes still fixed on the other food on the table, as if he was afraid that someone would snatch it from him. In this case, Harry wisely chose to share his joy in the flying lesson with Sherlock. You know what? Sherlock. I think this is a skill that I can master without a teacher. Speaking of which, you may not believe it, but I seem to know what to do naturally. As long as I lean forward and grab the broom tightly, it will keep accelerating. I can hear the whistling of the wind, and I can feel the robe fluttering behind me. It's so easy, so wonderful. I even think Malfoy is not as good as me. Looking at Harry's excited and gesticulating appearance, Sherlock nodded slightly. He understood what Harry said. He himself is also a very athletic person. He is good at boxing and fencing, and his coordination ability is naturally not bad. Based on the observation results, Malfoy is indeed not as good as you. Really? Harry was very happy to be affirmed by Sherlock. Effort determines the lower limit, and talent determines the upper limit. You have never been exposed to flying, but you are more skilled than Malfoy, which can already explain the problem. Harry straightened his chest upon hearing this. For Harry, Snape, the person he hated most in the entire school, could only rank second. The first is Malfoy. Of course, Sherlock was also the reason why the former was compared to Malfoy. Because Sherlock said Snape was a good person. It's just. Harry has worked very hard to believe Sherlock, but Snape is really disappointing. So he is still on Harry's most hated person list. What about me, what about me? At this time, Ron finally finished his dinner and burped contentedly. Hearing the conversation between Sherlock and Harry, he quickly pointed to his nose and said, Sherlock, do you think I have talent? Sherlock's eyes swept across Ron's nose, which seemed to be always covered in dust. To be honest, most people in this world have not reached the point where they can compete on talent. Harry chuckled softly, while Ron looked bewildered. Sherlock turned to Harry again, if you like flying, I suggest you sign up for the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Hey! As soon as Sherlock said this, Harry was as confused as Ron. Sherlock, you're not kidding, are you? First-year students are not eligible to participate in the college Quidditch team. As soon as he talked about this, Ron immediately woke up. There are exceptions to everything. Sherlock said calmly, as far as I know, Slytherin has not only won 6 consecutive championships in the College Cup, but also defeated Gryffindor in the Quidditch game. During that time, Professor McGonagall didn't even dare to meet Professor Snape for several weeks. Ron asked puzzled, how do you know this? Sherlock frowned, just need observation, I understand, please continue. Seeing that Ron had learned to answer quickly, Sherlock nodded with satisfaction and continued, in this case, you, who have flying talent, will have a great chance to be exceptionally added to the team. With Sherlock's description, Harry's breathing gradually became heavy. Join the Gryffindor team. This was something he had never thought of. But at this moment, when Sherlock said this, he immediately felt that this matter was promising. The key is, as Sherlock said, he likes to fly. The feeling of flying freely on a broom is so wonderful. He really likes this feeling so much. It is no exaggeration to say that this afternoon's flying experience was the happiest thing he had ever had since he could remember. After a while, he finally made up his mind. Sherlock, can you come with me? Of course. When he made this suggestion, Sherlock guessed that Harry would say this, so he naturally agreed. Harry breathed a long sigh of relief. It's strange to say that although he has only known Sherlock for a month, and the other party is his peer, every time he sees him, he will have a feeling of this is stable. It is no exaggeration to say that the sense of security that Sherlock brings to Harry even exceeds that of Hagrid, the giant. So at this moment, after receiving Sherlock's affirmative answer, Harry was immediately relieved. Me too. Ron couldn't help but said, since they were all going, why not give it a try? Sherlock glanced at him and said nothing. Hey, what do you mean by that look? Sorry, excuse me. Just when Ron felt a little broken, a figure appeared in front of them. Granger. Because he was interrupted by Hermione, Ron looked unhappy, and even the goodwill he had previously had for her for speaking up for Sherlock and Harry could not be offset. Can't you let people eat in peace? Hermione ignored him and just looked at Sherlock and said, I couldn't help but eavesdrop on what you and Potter said. I knew you would do this. Ron whispered again from the side. Sherlock, shut up. Ron. Sherlock, can we talk alone? Sherlock didn't answer, but stood up directly. Harry, did you see that? He was fierce to me, he was actually fierce to me. Staring straight at Sherlock leaving with Hermione, Ron turned his head suddenly and said to Harry with a grievance. Harry. We met on the train. We eat and live together, but he actually favors that woman. Harry. Also, did you hear that? That woman actually called him Sherlock. And he didn't refuse. Harry. I didn't expect Sherlock to be someone who values women over friends, I really misjudged him. That. Ron. Faced with Ron's repeated accusations, Harry was really a little overwhelmed and couldn't help but said, Did you forget that Sherlock said that he and Granger knew each other before school started? What do you mean by this? Strictly speaking, she came first. Ron. Chapter 39. Sherlock followed Hermione to a deserted table. After hesitating for a moment, she finally spoke, Sherlock, can you teach me to fly? After saying this, she looked at Sherlock somewhat nervously. If it were just after the start of the term, or half a month ago, or even a week ago, she wouldn't have made such a sudden request. After all, at that time, the two of them could only be considered acquaintances. Compared to other students, they had only known each other a little earlier. Her relationship with Sherlock was naturally not as close as Harry's, and not even as close as Ron the Glutton after all, they were roommates. But for every weekend over the past month, she had been in the library with Sherlock. Especially after last weekend, she felt that she and Sherlock could be considered friends. After all, they had already started addressing each other by their first names instead of their last names, hadn't they? Another reason was that she felt from the bottom of her heart that Sherlock was the same kind of person as her. Hermione believed that her poor performance in flying class was more due to psychological factors. In this situation, she naturally thought of Sherlock. Sherlock, what did Granger want with you? When Sherlock returned to the dining hall, Harry asked curiously. She must also want to join the Quidditch team, Ron said definitively. Humph, it's a pity that what she saw in the books can't teach her to fly well. You're right, so she wants me to teach her. I knew it. Wait, what did you say? Ron stared at Sherlock with wide eyes. Harry was also a little surprised. Hermione Granger? That little girl who always had an arrogant look on her face? It was hard to imagine that she would ask a classmate for help. But then he thought that the person she was asking for help was Sherlock Holmes, and Harry felt relieved. Did you promise her? Yes. Ron's eyes widened even more, and he looked incredulous. You actually agreed? No, how could you agree? Sherlock ignored Ron. Sherlock was naturally willing to help someone he was close to when they made a request. Moreover, helping Hermione improve her flying skills was just a small matter for him, and it wouldn't take much effort. His energy was mainly spent on other things. After being at the magic school for a month, Sherlock had already figured out the structure of Hogwarts. Not to mention first-year students, even if the scope was expanded to the entire school's teachers and students, there were few people who knew it better than him. The only people who surpassed him in this regard were the caretaker Filch and the Weasley twins. Under normal circumstances, he should have gone on an adventure at this time. But magic was, after all, a brand new version that Sherlock had never encountered before. In this version, many things could not be analyzed and judged with the scientific thinking that he had become accustomed to. Humans cannot understand things beyond their imagination. That was why he and Hermione became the two freshmen who liked to ask the most questions. It was also for this reason that Hermione believed that Sherlock was the same kind of person as her. But in fact, although both of them liked to ask questions, they were different in essence. Hermione's questions were aimed at the course itself, and belonged to addressing the matter at hand. Sherlock's questions often extended beyond the classroom, full of thinking and research about magic. So although both of them were considered good students because they loved to ask questions, Hermione loved to ask and answer, while Sherlock only asked and did not answer. Of course, when asked by the teaching teacher, he could always answer perfectly. A month had passed, and Sherlock already had his own understanding of the magical world. It was time to have deeper contact with the school's teachers. Assisting Harry in joining the Quidditch team was the opportunity. On Friday morning, after being deducted points by Snape as usual in potions class, Sherlock took the nervous and excited Harry and Ron to see Professor McGonagall. "What, the three of you want to join the Quidditch team?" It was not easy for a freshman to see the deputy headmaster, but after all, there was the golden sign of Harry Potter, so the three of them successfully met Professor McGonagall. But when McGonagall heard the three people's intentions, she couldn't help but reveal a surprised look. "No, only these two." Sherlock pointed to Harry and Ron, indicating that he was just there to accompany them. "You are simply ridiculous. Freshmen have not even mastered the most basic flying, and they still want to participate in the team? Do you want to break your necks?" Professor McGonagall was always known for her fairness and strictness. As the deputy headmaster, her deterrent power among the students was even higher than that of Dumbledore, the headmaster. At this moment, her stern voice made Harry and Ron tremble, fearing that she would say Gryffindor loses 10 points in the next moment. Not to mention the originally unconfident Harry, even the ambitious Ron was discouraged. The two of them turned their pleading eyes to Sherlock. McGonagall was old and sophisticated, and she realized this situation at a glance. "Mr. Holmes, is this your intention?" Her gaze became a little dangerous. During the session before the start of school, Sherlock had already left a deep impression on her. At the sorting ceremony, he, like herself back then, became a hat's tall that would only appear once every 50 years. After the official start of school, Sherlock's performance was even more amazing. Just his understanding and application of transfiguration exceeded that of some older students. And the technique of stroking cats. In short, for various reasons, Professor McGonagall treated Sherlock differently, treating him as a key concern like Hermione. But compared to the worry-free Hermione, Sherlock's student was very partial. In some professors' classes, he actively asked questions, and even the teachers could not get away after class. For some courses, he would only go to listen to the class, and would leave without any nostalgia as soon as class was over. What's more, he would simply be absent from some courses. For example, Professor Quirrell's defense against the dark arts. This made McGonagall very headache. Although Sherlock could get back the points deducted for being absent from other places. But in the long run, this behavior would inevitably have a bad influence on others. After all, defense against the dark arts was a compulsory rather than an elective course. If everyone ignored school rules and regulations like him, and decided whether or not to take this course based on their own preferences, wouldn't the school be in chaos? Even the mischievous Weasley twins were not like him. Originally, McGonagall wanted to find an opportunity to talk to Sherlock, but she didn't expect him to take the initiative to come to her today. What was even more unexpected was that he even encouraged Harry and Ron to participate in the team. It was just right to give him a lesson. Just as McGonagall was pondering, Sherlock had already spoken. "It's my suggestion. I think Harry's talent is enough to break the rules." Facing the gaze that was enough to make Harry and Ron tremble, Sherlock said something that made McGonagall's heart ache. "Professor, you don't want Gryffindor to always be suppressed by other colleges, do you?" Chapter 40. In all my years at Hogwarts, never have I ever. McGonagall was both heartbroken and furious, the anger in her eyes shining through her spectacles. "How dare you? Indeed, how dare he?" Harry and Ron looked at Sherlock with admiration. A true Gryffindor. Sherlock was so brave. Bravery is the best substitute for stupidity. I've always believed that. But the professor would do well to decide after seeing Harry's performance. I believe he won't let you down. After all, not daring to face Professor Snape for weeks doesn't feel good, does it? Sherlock Holmes. At that moment, McGonagall seemed genuinely angry. As for Harry and Ron, their gazes towards Sherlock were now filled with nothing but worship. Experienced teenagers know that when elders call you by your full name, it means big trouble. Professor McGonagall was clearly in that situation. Although what Sherlock said was indeed correct. The Slytherin Quidditch team was very strong. Especially last year, when Gryffindor was utterly defeated by Slytherin. McGonagall, as Sherlock said, hadn't dared to face Snape for weeks. As for how Sherlock knew about this, she didn't want to know any more. Do you want to be put in detention? Facts were facts, but being pointed out so directly by Sherlock was undoubtedly rubbing salt in Professor McGonagall's wound. Knowing that deducting points wouldn't deter Sherlock much, she simply proposed a new form of punishment. The coldness in her somber voice made Harry and Ron desperately lower their heads. Both were stiff, their hands and feet were cold, and they trembled all over, wanting to say something, but unable to utter a word. At that moment, they both began to regret coming to McGonagall. Especially Harry. Professor McGonagall originally had a good impression of Sherlock. But now he was being treated like this. It was all his fault. Detention is just a means, not an end, and it doesn't solve the problem. Facing the angry lion, Sherlock said calmly and composedly, even if the professor gives me detention, I still suggest letting Harry join the house team. That's the real solution. A month into the semester, Sherlock was no longer the little wight who knew nothing about the magical world. He knew very well how fanatical wizards were about Quidditch. In the magical world, the status of Quidditch was equivalent to football in the Muggle world. Even more so. The main reason was that the Muggle world had no magic and could only rely on physical strength. Therefore, they were much more exciting in sports than wizards. Putting aside the track and field events, just talking about ball sports. Football was the undisputed #1 sport in the world. The World Cup, held every 4 years, was the biggest sporting event in the Muggle world. Only the Olympics, also held every 4 years, could compete with it. But the content of the Olympics originally included hundreds of events, including football. No single event could compete with the World Cup. Basketball and volleyball, 2 of the 3 major ball sports, were liked by many people. Tennis, table tennis, badminton, and rugby, although regional sports, also had considerable popularity worldwide. With the re-emergence of a certain mysterious Eastern power, the status of table tennis and badminton was also rapidly rising. Even niche ball sports like hockey, ice hockey, cricket, and golf had a fixed following. Especially with the re-emergence of a certain self-proclaimed mysterious Eastern power, the status of cricket was also rapidly rising. But in the wizarding world, the only event that could be called a large-scale event was Quidditch. It was no exaggeration to say that everyone in the magical world loved Quidditch. It would be fine if you couldn't play Quidditch after all. In the Muggle world, there were also people who weren't good at running. But if you couldn't even catch up with topics related to Quidditch when chatting with people, you wouldn't even be embarrassed to say hello. Under such a premise, Sherlock believed that McGonagall would give in. Sure enough, after Sherlock once again pointed out the problem, Professor McGonagall's expression began to change constantly. Finally, after noticing Sherlock's confident look once again, she said, "You 3, come with me." Sherlock followed without saying a word. Harry and Ron exchanged glances, and their legs seemed to regain consciousness, quickly blending in. When the 3 of them left the castle under McGonagall's lead and arrived at the Quidditch training ground, someone was already waiting there. It was a man of average build. He was also carrying a large wooden crate under his arm. This is Oliver Wood, a 5th-year student and the captain of the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Professor McGonagall didn't say anything extra, and directly addressed Sherlock. "Mr. Holmes, let Potter show his talent now. I believe you should understand that if he can't satisfy me and Wood as you said, then I will voluntarily serve a month of detention." Seeing that Professor McGonagall seemed to want to say something, Sherlock added, "And from now on, I will no longer be absent from defense against the dark arts classes." McGonagall looked at Sherlock with some surprise. This little boy. His observation and analysis skills were really too sharp. Once again guessed what she wanted to say. She was now faintly beginning to suspect that in the first transfiguration class, Holmes had seen through her disguise. Sherlock. Harry, who was on the side, was so moved that he couldn't help himself. He was about to say something, but Sherlock preemptively said, "Dear Harry, if you don't want me to smell that terrible garlic smell like you better perform well. As everyone knew, Professor Quirrell filled every place he went with the smell of garlic. According to rumors, this was specially set up to drive away a vampire he encountered in Romania. Harry nodded heavily. Only then did Wood have the opportunity to speak, and he looked Harry up and down. Professor, this is the one you mentioned. No, Mr. Holmes mentioned him. As soon as Quidditch was mentioned, the Gryffindor captain seemed to have changed into a different person. He circled Harry a few times, carefully examining him. The famous Harry Potter, well, that's not important. But just looking at his physique, he is really suitable to be a seeker, light and agile. By the way, Potter, I heard that you grew up in a Muggle family. Have you watched a Quidditch match? Harry shook his head honestly. Although Wood was a little surprised, he didn't say much. He opened the crate, revealing 4 balls of different sizes. Ron's eyes lit up instantly. Chapter 41. Wood heard that Harry had never played Quidditch before, so he opened the box to show him the game balls. Let me explain the rules to you first. No need to bother. Sherlock interrupted Wood, just find 2 flying brooms. Wood looked at McGonagall, and when he saw her nod, he found 2 flying brooms. Sherlock handed one of them to Harry, then jumped on the other and flew directly into the air, signaling Harry to follow. Wood's eyes lit up instantly. As the saying goes, a master reveals himself with a single move. As the team captain, just the takeoff action was enough for him to see a lot. Obviously, these 2 young wizards were both talented in flying. In mid-air, Harry, keeping pace with Sherlock, asked nervously, Sherlock, what do we do next? Sherlock took something directly from his pocket and waved it in front of Harry. Look! It was a ball-shaped object, shining brightly in the sunlight. Neville's Remembrall? How is it with you? Harry recognized it at a glance. I swiped it from him before going to Professor McGonagall. Harry looked shocked. Weren't we together? When did you? Harry, that's not important, Sherlock interrupted Harry, your task now is to prevent it from falling to the ground. Hey! Harry couldn't understand. Wasn't the Remembrall in Sherlock's hand? Why would it fall to the ground? Sherlock didn't explain, but just smiled slightly. Dear Harry, you wouldn't want Neville to be sad because the Remembrall was broken, would you? Harry. As soon as Sherlock said this, Harry had an ominous premonition. The next moment. Go! Sherlock threw the Neville's Remembrall directly out. He didn't give Harry any time to prepare, or rather, that sentence was already a reminder for Harry to be prepared. Harry didn't expect Sherlock to do this at all. Fortunately, his body reacted faster than his brain. Almost without thinking, he pointed the flying broom downwards, accelerating and diving towards the ground. With the double blessing of gravitational acceleration and magic, his speed became faster and faster, and he was about to crash heavily on the ground. At this time, Harry could even hear Ron's screams mixed in with the whistling wind, but he was not nervous at all. Not only was he not nervous, but he was also unusually calm, even a little excited. Finally, he caught the glass ball 1 foot above the ground. He straightened the broom in time, letting it fall gently on the grass, his palm firmly gripping the Remembrall. At this time, he also found that Sherlock had returned to the ground at some point, and was about to speak when a roar came from behind. Potter! McGonagall strode over, the wand in her hand had not had time to put away, and the palm of her right hand holding the wand was full of sweat. Just a little bit more, and she would have had to use magic to save him. In all my years at Hogwarts, I have never. Familiar words made Sherlock raise his eyebrows. How dare you? You'll break your neck. Harry was speechless, he really didn't know what to say at this time. It always felt like anything he said would be wrong. Fortunately, there was Sherlock. Professor, I think this performance is enough to prove Harry's talent. The calm voice formed a sharp contrast with McGonagall. Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock's words immediately drew the fire away from Harry, which made the latter secretly breathe a sigh of relief, and his gratitude to Sherlock rose again. Letting a classmate do that kind of thing, you are simply audacious. If something happens to Potter, you will be fully responsible. He will be fine. I believe in him, and I believe in the professor even more. You. McGonagall was choked and couldn't speak. Genius, a true genius. At this moment, Wood opened his mouth at the right time, interrupting McGonagall, who was brewing emotions. Diving 50 feet, steadily catching that thing, and without even a scratch. Even Charlie Weasley can't do that. He almost jumped to Harry's side in one stride. He firmly grasped the hand that Harry was holding. The remembrance, the fascination and fanaticism in his eyes made the corners of McGonagall's mouth twitch. "Professor, listen to me, you must get him a decent broom. I think, get him a Nimbus 2000 or a Comet 260. No, it must be a Nimbus 2000. His appearance had to make McGonagall stop getting angry at Sherlock. "Wood, Potter is just a first year. That's not a problem." Wood waved his hand domineeringly and said, "Professor, you must go to Professor Dumbledore and let us use a first-year student as an exception. If you don't go, I'll go myself. You know, we need a Quidditch team that's even better than last year's. Harry, I welcome you to the Gryffindor team on behalf of the team. I am now formally notifying you as the captain that training will begin next week." McGonagall. Looking at Wood talking to himself, McGonagall suddenly felt a little redundant. Oliver Wood is indeed a good student with excellent character and academics. But as long as Quidditch is mentioned, he seems to have become a different person. However, she had to admit that Wood was indeed right. Harry Potter, he really is a genius. Potter. Harry quickly turned to McGonagall, making a gesture of listening attentively. "I hope to hear that you are training hard, otherwise I will change my mind and punish you." At this moment, Harry could hardly believe what he heard. He was actually promoted as an exception. "Be sure to keep it a secret, after all, this is the smallest team player in a century, and you will be our secret weapon at that time." Judging from the expression on Wood's face alone, it was as if he had already won the House Cup. Hopefully. Sherlock was non-committal about this. He didn't hold out hope that this matter could be kept secret. "As for you, Mr. Holmes." Professor McGonagall turned to Sherlock, "Harry's performance didn't make you lose points, and it also spared you the punishment of being confined, but that doesn't prove that your reckless behavior is correct." Sherlock sighed. He had already guessed what the other party was going to say next. Sure enough, Professor McGonagall took the opportunity to make a request. "So I don't want to hear anyone tell me that you are absent from Professor Quirrell's defense against the dark arts class again." "Okay, Professor." Sherlock agreed simply and neatly, which surprised and disappointed McGonagall. She originally thought that this maverick little guy would resist. Chapter 42. Of course, Sherlock wouldn't resist. Through Professor McGonagall's words and actions, he had already deduced that she wouldn't compromise on this matter. Since that was the case, there was no need to make an unnecessary move. With his considerable knowledge of psychology, he knew very well that when facing the side in control of the situation, the more the weaker side struggled, the more excited the other side would become. "Potter, your father would be proud of you." Seeing that Sherlock's problem was resolved, McGonagall looked at Harry again. He used to be an excellent Quidditch player. As she said this, a smile bloomed on her face. At that moment, Harry couldn't help but be stunned. Since the start of the semester, he had never seen Professor McGonagall smile so brightly. Even when Sherlock and Hermione won points for Gryffindor in Transfiguration class, she would only smile at most. He didn't expect her to be so happy because he joined the Quidditch team. Indeed, Professor McGonagall was a good person. It would be even better if she could assign less homework. The atmosphere was harmonious, and this action of joining the Quidditch team came to a perfect end. Just then, a discordant voice suddenly emerged. Haven't you guys forgotten something?" Ron, who had been ignored for a long time, raised his hand and said weakly, "What about me?" From the beginning of the meeting until now, Wood had only glanced at Ron when Charlie Weasley was mentioned. There was no way around it. Compared to Sherlock and Harry, his presence was too weak. You. McGonagall and Wood both looked at Ron with suspicious eyes. Being stared at by such gazes, Ron, who was still muttering softly, immediately couldn't take it anymore. He immediately shouted out in protest. "I've been playing Quidditch with Charlie since I was little, I want to join the team too." Hearing Ron's words, Wood immediately became interested. "Do you have a talent like Potter?" Ron's face immediately turned as red as his hair. The boy's blush was the best answer. Although somewhat disappointed, Wood decided to give Ron a chance. "Take a test flight." "Okay." Ron nodded emphatically. Having obtained the opportunity, Ron performed well. It could be said that he was performing above his usual level. He even made several dangerous moves in the air that he had wanted to do before but didn't dare to. Even with Wood's critical eye, Ron's level could be considered barely satisfactory, already very good among the first-year students. However, it was far from being as excellent as Harry, who could be exceptionally admitted to the team. He wasn't polite and directly told Ron the answer. Ron immediately became a little dejected. Harry was about to say a few words of comfort when Wood suddenly turned to Sherlock Holmes. What about you? Don't you want to give it a try? Harry. Ron. Wood didn't notice the expressions of the two, or rather, even if he did, he wouldn't care. In his opinion, although Sherlock's action of flying into the air just now was only to showcase Harry's talent, that one action was already very impressive. To say nothing else, it was definitely better than Ron. But he still had to see more of Sherlock's performance. Unexpectedly, Sherlock actually refused him. No need, I have no interest in this. Having Harry in the Quidditch team was enough to collect information. If he joined as well, it would be a waste of resources. His time and energy still had to be put into other things. Hearing Sherlock say this, Wood couldn't help but feel a little regretful. However, what they lacked most now was a seeker, and Harry was undoubtedly the only choice for this position. Although Sherlock might also be an excellent player, Gryffindor's need for other positions wasn't so urgent. Having already gotten Harry, and with Sherlock unwilling himself, Wood didn't insist. The most urgent task was to train Harry as soon as possible. After Sherlock and the others left, McGonagall was about to say something, but Wood was already asking anxiously. Professor, when are you going to find Headmaster Dumbledore? McGonagall. Enough is enough. Sherlock, you should have agreed to him. Just after walking out of the Quidditch field, Ron immediately said to Sherlock, although I'm grateful that you rejected Wood to take care of my feelings, such an opportunity is not easy to come by. I think you might have misunderstood. Sherlock turned his head to look at Ron, and said with a serious face. I rejected him because I don't have time to attend training 3 times a week, it has nothing to do with you. In fact, whether I join the Gryffindor team or not, it won't affect your fate of being rejected. Ron. Even if that's the case, did you have to say it? Looking at Ron's appearance, Harry couldn't help but suggest in a low voice, Sherlock, I think, sometimes you don't have to make things so clear. Dear Harry, I've told you before, in most cases I don't lie unless it's necessary. Actually I think now is one of those necessary situations. No, merely lying to take care of that pitiful self-esteem, thereby causing people to produce unrealistic fantasies, is irresponsible to him. Not having talent is not a shameful thing, correctly recognizing the gap between oneself and others can significantly improve efficiency. That way, you won't waste time on some obviously unachievable goals. Harry found that he couldn't argue with Sherlock. Not only couldn't he argue, but he was also convinced by Sherlock. What he said made so much sense that he was speechless. It's just that as Ron's friend, he still felt that it was a bit cruel. Sherlock was too rational. He won't have any friends if he keeps going like this. Fortunately, Ron's frustration came and went quickly. When he saw the sumptuous dinner, he immediately put this matter behind him. Eat. In the following month, Sherlock was still busy. Most of his time was still spent discussing magic with the professors of the various courses he was interested in. Again, wanting to understand and accept a completely new system and worldview, and then use it for oneself, is not an easy thing. Even a genius like Sherlock still needs to spend time continuously. As for the time originally set aside for exploring the Forbidden Forest and the small dark room, it was also occupied by other things. First, it was to promise McGonagall not to be absent from Defense Against the Dark Arts lessons again. Professor Quirrell's lectures were really boring. To describe them as reading from the textbook would already be praising him. Because Professor Binns, the ghost who also liked to read from the textbook in History of Magic, could answer calmly when someone asked a question. It's just that his hearing was a bit bad, and he had to repeat things several times, such as gra what ger, her what enger, gran what ger, which made people feel a little helpless. On the other hand, Quirrell would evade the question when asked, vaguely talking about the weather. When asked too much, his face would turn red, his eyes would twitch, and he would look like he was overly frightened. It was hard to believe that he used to be a top student at Ravenclaw. According to insiders, Quirrell only became like this after encountering vampires and witches in the Dark Forest. But through observing Quirrell, Sherlock deduced that what he encountered in the Dark Forest was definitely not just these. He must be hiding a secret. Currently, Sherlock was not interested in this secret. After all, based on his observations during this period, Dumbledore, McGonagall, Snape, Flitwick, Sprout, Hagrid, Filch. It was no exaggeration to say that all the faculty members of the school had secrets. In this case, unless it was related to crime, Sherlock wouldn't bother paying attention. The second thing was Harry. Chapter 43. Just as Sherlock had predicted before the start of term, the name Harry Potter meant that he would always be at the center of events. Even if he did nothing, trouble would come looking for him. In the nearly 2 months since the start of the term, he had already encountered many incidents, including but not limited to being strongly surrounded by students whose enthusiasm had not yet dissipated, Peeves the poltergeist actively showing up to harass him, getting lost and ending up in the forbidden room that Dumbledore had explicitly prohibited, only to be caught by Filch, the moving staircases inexplicably shifting, and Malfoy's proactive provocations, among other things. The previous situations were manageable, as long as Sherlock was there, everything could be resolved smoothly. But Sherlock couldn't be with Harry every moment. As a result, whenever he wasn't around, Harry had to face these problems alone, and as for Ron, his presence or absence made no difference. As for the last item, it was purely trouble coming to his door. After being taught a lesson by Sherlock on the train, Malfoy was indeed quiet for a while. But the collective life in Slytherin clearly gave him confidence. A month after the start of term, he began to provoke Harry again. However, out of fear of Sherlock, he knew that Crabbe and Goyle combined were no match for Sherlock. Malfoy naturally didn't want to and didn't dare to confront Harry directly. So he cleverly chose to change his approach and take a roundabout route. One morning, Malfoy found Harry and proposed a duel. If it was just a challenge, there was no need to worry that Sherlock would intervene. Sherlock indeed did not intervene. Not only did he not intervene, but he also developed a considerable interest in the so-called duel. Because it touched upon his area of ignorance. Wizard duels? It sounded quite interesting. At this crucial moment, Ron jumped out. He stated that he would serve as the second for this duel. Not only that, but he also arranged to meet Malfoy at the trophy room at midnight, in front of a bewildered Harry. By the time Malfoy left, Harry hadn't recovered. Immediately afterward, Sherlock learned the rules of wizard duels through Ron's long and rambling description. He quickly came to a conclusion. A so-called wizard duel is a formal contest with a sense of ritual that has formed over a long period in wizarding culture. Ron thought for a moment and said in surprise, "It seems that's really the case, you actually made a summary so quickly. It's just tradition, it's just learning the ways of medieval night duels, except that both sides are limited to using magic." Sherlock waved his hand. "Unfortunately, the true spirit of chivalry is almost non-existent these days, but that's not the point. Are you serious about being Harry's second? After all, according to the rules of the duel, if one of the duelists dies, the second has to take over." Ron. Harry was startled upon hearing this and was about to speak, but Ron noticed his pale face and quickly added. "That's what it means, but you and Malfoy know too little magic, you won't really hurt each other, at most you'll just shoot sparks at each other." Harry breathed a sigh of relief, but then looked at Sherlock with some distress. "But what if I wave my wand and nothing happens?" "Then throw away your wand and punch him in the nose," Ron said before Sherlock could even open his mouth. Harry was stunned for a moment, then looked at Sherlock with pleading eyes. "Good advice," Sherlock said seriously. "To achieve your goals, sometimes you shouldn't be bound by formalities." Receiving Sherlock's support for the first time, Ron immediately gained confidence and became more assertive. "But if it were me, I wouldn't go today." "Why?" Ron, who had just hardened, asked in surprise. "Refusing a duel is the act of a coward. That's not very Gryffindor. Courage is the best substitute for stupidity," Sherlock said lightly, "because Malfoy doesn't intend to go there at all. Dear Harry, I bet you a galleon that if you go there, you'll most likely be greeted by Filch." As soon as he said this, Harry's face, which had returned to normal, turned pale again. "Impossible. Absolutely impossible," Ron immediately retorted. "Although Malfoy is indeed an idiot, he is, after all, one of the sacred 28. "Shut up, Ron, you're lowering the IQ of the entire school." "Ron. Just now, when you mentioned the second, Malfoy chose one from Crabbe and Goyle. If he was really prepared for a duel, he wouldn't be so hasty, waiting until you mentioned it to make a decision. This is clearly just perfunctory, just to lure you to a location he has already arranged. Although he is trying his best to hide it, if you are careful enough, you can still see that his right leg is slightly limp. He must have been injured while practicing flying. I guess you didn't notice that he didn't stay on his broom as long as usual during yesterday's flying lesson. Harry and Ron looked at each other, they really hadn't noticed. Damn it, is it again the difference between seeing and observing? Also, his reaction to Harry choosing Ron as his second was too calm. If I were Malfoy, when I saw that Harry chose Ron instead of Sherlock as his second, even if I wasn't ecstatic, I would definitely be relieved. Ron. But he wasn't. Once again ignoring Ron's resentful face, Sherlock directly concluded, he doesn't care who goes with Harry, because he doesn't intend to duel at all. As for the so-called Sacred 28, it's just a self-amusing joke. Sherlock looked disdainful. What age is it, and they're still doing that bloodline theory? It has to be said that in some respects, the magical world is really too backward. Sherlock's influence on Harry was still very significant. He was eventually successfully persuaded not to attend the duel. It also proved that Sherlock was right. Because Malfoy didn't mention the duel at all the next day. On the contrary, he seemed extremely surprised when he saw Harry and Ron safe and sound. Upon seeing this, Ron couldn't help but rejoice that Harry had listened to Sherlock. He had been encouraging Harry to act last night, but the latter refused. But he naturally wouldn't say such a thing. He seized the opportunity and mercilessly mocked Malfoy. With the help of the Weasley twins' publicity, the whole school soon knew that Malfoy had invited Harry to a duel but he hadn't accepted. This made Malfoy unable to lift his head for a long time. It also deepened the little lion's understanding of Sherlock. Gradually, some people began to consult him about problems they encountered in daily life. Sherlock basically didn't refuse anyone, and through these things, it helped him to further understand the magical world. Among them, the most frequent was Neville, who lived in the same dormitory as him. His pet toad named Trevor would often go missing. Malfoy was naturally unwilling to be humiliated like this. If one plan fails, he will come up with another. He paid close attention to Harry at all times, hoping to regain face. The opportunity soon came. Chapter 44. It was a seemingly ordinary morning. As the owls flew into the Great Hall as usual, almost everyone's attention was drawn to a slender package carried by 6 long-eared owls. Sherlock glanced up and then looked away. Harry, like everyone else, was eager to know what was in the package. Ron, on the other hand, kept his head down and ate heartily. Just as Harry was about to ask Sherlock, several owls swooped down, and the package landed right in front of him, even knocking his bacon onto the floor. Harry was extremely surprised. What is this? Ron, who was eating, was also stunned. He was about to open it when he heard Sherlock say, "If I were you, I wouldn't touch it." Ron immediately withdrew his hand. As if to verify Sherlock's words, just as the owls flapped their wings and flew away, another owl flew in and precisely dropped a letter on top of the package. Harry picked up the letter and was about to tear it open, but Ron stopped him. He looked at Sherlock. "Can I open the letter?" Harry was a little dumbfounded. Ron's reaction was a typical case of overcorrection. "Open it, I think this is Professor McGonagall's gift to you." Upon hearing this, Harry no longer cared about how Sherlock had figured it out. He tore open the letter with trembling hands, and it contained only a few short lines. "Do not open the package on the table, it contains your new Nimbus 2000 flying broom. I don't want everyone to know you have a new broom, lest they all want one. Oliver Wood is waiting for you at the Quidditch pitch at 7 tonight for your first training session. By the way, Mr. Holmes's package is here too, remember to hand it over to him." "Sherlock, Professor McGonagall said your package was delivered here as well." Harry forcibly suppressed his excitement and handed the letter to Sherlock and Ron. Sherlock was a little surprised. Although he had deduced that this was Professor McGonagall's gift to Harry through the shape and weight of the package, he did not expect her to send his mail along with it. "Nimbus 2000. Ron exclaimed enviously, "I haven't even touched one." "You can touch it as much as you want this time," Harry said, then turned to Sherlock and asked curiously, "What's in your package?" "A violin sent by my family." Sherlock's voice was calm, but Harry and Ron were directly shocked. "What did you say? You can play the violin? Knowledgeable, knows how to box, knows how to fence, and now he even says he can play the violin? Isn't that a bit too broad?" Sherlock did not answer directly but asked, "By the way, do you think playing the violin is noisy?" Harry shook his head first. No. What noise hadn't he experienced at the Dursleys' house? The sound of Aunt Petunia banging on the cupboard door every day had long exceeded the standard, not to mention Uncle Vernon's roar and Dudley's crying. Ron hesitated. It depends on whether it's played well or not. If it's played well, it's as beautiful as music. If it's played badly, then there's no problem. Sherlock interrupted Ron before he could finish. Harry and Ron looked at each other. So confident? The three chatted for a few words and then left quickly, mainly because Harry and Ron planned to find a quiet place to open the package and take a good look. But after only 2 steps, Sherlock stopped and turned to look behind him. Sherlock, what's wrong? Harry couldn't help but ask. Sherlock withdrew his gaze. It's nothing, let's go. He noticed someone was following, but after a little thought, he ignored it. Anyway, it was destined to be a futile effort. Ever since the owls dropped off the package, Malfoy had been paying attention to Harry. Like everyone else, he was full of curiosity about the slender package. So as soon as he saw Sherlock and the others leave, he brought Crabbe and Goyle and began to tail them without saying a word. The moment the package was opened, Malfoy was almost ecstatic. As everyone knows, first-year students are not allowed to bring flying brooms. Before school started, he had put a lot of thought into secretly bringing a flying broom to school, but unfortunately, he didn't succeed in the end. Now that he had such an opportunity, he would never let it go. In his opinion, Snape originally hated Harry, so wouldn't he take this opportunity to kill him? Expulsion was unlikely, but detention was definitely no problem. Although Sherlock was indeed very powerful, now that he had caught them red-handed, even if he had great abilities, it would be useless. Malfoy never expected that when he found Professor Snape, who had always been quite nice to him, would scold him with a dark face. "Mr. Draco, I advise you to mind your own business." Malfoy was stunned. What was going on? Without Sherlock's help, this matter was over? How would he know that this flying broom was a gift from Professor McGonagall to Harry? Sherlock's words had ultimately worked, and she didn't want to be suppressed all the time. In addition, with Wood's strong recommendation, Professor McGonagall finally paid out of her own pocket to purchase the latest model of flying broom for Harry, the Nimbus 2000. Just in case, she had greeted the other professors in advance, including Snape, of course. So when Malfoy ran over to complain with great interest, Snape only thought he was foolish. Malfoy returned in defeat, and Crabbe and Goyle, who didn't know the truth, hurried over. At this time, Harry and Ron had finished looking at the flying broom and the violin and were about to leave. Crabbe and Goyle naturally wanted to stop them. But the two were worried about being beaten up by Sherlock again. Just as Malfoy, the backbone, returned, a sneer appeared on their faces. "Potter, you're done for." However, "Let them go." "What?" Crabbe and Goyle almost thought they had heard wrong, and Crabbe couldn't help but say. "Draco, he's holding a flying broom, and it's the latest model Nimbus 2000. Didn't you say before?" "I said let them go." Malfoy roared in a low voice. At this moment, even without Sherlock's explanation, Harry and Ron understood what had happened. Looking at the angry and confused Malfoy, Harry almost laughed out loud. Ron would not miss the opportunity to ridicule mercilessly. "Malfoy, your Comet 260 is not bad, but it's not in the same league as the Nimbus at all." Malfoy was submissive when facing Sherlock, but he struck hard when facing Ron. "Shut up, Weasley, you can't even afford half a broom. I bet you and your brothers have to save up twig by twig to buy a flying broom, right?" "What did you say? Say it again if you dare." Sherlock shook his head as he watched them bickering. Childish. But thinking about it, that was the mental state that an 11-year-old should have in the first place. Compared to them, he was the abnormal one. Just then, Hermione arrived, and glancing at Professor Flitwick not far away, Sherlock knew that this group of people wouldn't cause trouble. He simply left the group and followed Hermione away. To give Hermione flying training. This was the third thing that occupied Sherlock's time. It must be said that Hermione's flying talent was beyond Sherlock's expectations. Chapter 45. In this world, some people are just naturally bad at certain things. For example, some people are bad at running. Others are bad at memorizing, unable to memorize words, sentences, or articles no matter how hard they try. A few are bad at reading aloud, stuttering and stumbling every time, unable to read fluently even after reading the text several times. A very few are bad at understanding, feeling like they understand in class but realizing they don't know anything during exams. And some are simply bad at learning. For Hermione, it was that while she excelled in other courses, she seemed like a different person in flying class. Even shortcomings that weren't apparent in other classes were fully exposed in front of Sherlock. This made Hermione even more embarrassed. The more she tried to overcome it, the more flustered she became. Seeing this, Sherlock simply took matters into his own hands. After teaching Hermione hand in hand for several days, he finally achieved a barely satisfactory result. He initially helped Hermione overcome her fear of heights. In fact, everyone has some degree of acrophobia. It's just that some people have it mildly, and others have it severely. Many people don't think they have acrophobia because the height hasn't reached their threshold. After Sherlock's analysis and deduction, Hermione's acrophobia was classified as a specific phobia, which is easy to solve with the right treatment. He took Hermione on a flying broomstick, gradually increasing the height, eventually stopping at a position that triggered her fear, each time for at least half an hour. Initially, this level of exposure made Hermione blush a little. But soon, fear replaced all other thoughts. Especially after reaching a certain height, Hermione trembled, her hands and feet turned cold, she broke out in cold sweats in the middle of winter, and tears flowed uncontrollably. The first few times, she even blacked out and fainted. If Sherlock hadn't noticed something was wrong and held her in time, she would have fallen headfirst from the flying broomstick. After a while, even Hermione had the idea of giving up. This is too hard for me. However, seeing that Sherlock didn't seem to care and even looked like he would be relieved if she gave up, she stubbornly persevered. After all, compared to others, Hermione only wanted to have in-depth exchanges with Sherlock. For nearly 2 months since the start of school, she hadn't gotten along well with her roommates or even the students in the entire class. In fact, Hermione's relationship with her classmates was really just that of classmates. She could actually sense it herself. After all, this had already happened when she was studying in the Muggle world. The students mostly thought she was arrogant, liked to show off, and often lectured others. As the saying goes, honest advice is hard to swallow. In this world, no one likes to be lectured by others all the time, except for those with special hobbies. Especially teenagers of this age. They can't even listen to their parents and elders, let alone classmates. When she came to Hogwarts, this situation didn't change. The students felt that Hermione valued school rules too much and took grades too seriously. This was Gryffindor. Taking the Weasley twins as an example, the little lions never followed the rules. Reckless troublemakers may be a stereotype, but to some extent, it does reflect some information. Because of this, Hermione had many unpleasant arguments with her classmates. This even included Harry and Ron. The cause was Malfoy's invitation to Harry for a wizard's duel. After hearing the news, she privately advised them. Her intentions were good. But there was a problem in the execution. You absolutely can't wander around the school at night, think about how many points Gryffindor will lose if you get caught. And you'll definitely get caught, you're really too selfish. Saying such things was already uncomfortable. What was even more speechless was that she did another thing. She guarded the fat lady's portrait in the middle of the night to see if Harry and Ron would really go night wandering in the school. Of course, Harry didn't go to find Malfoy after listening to Sherlock. So Hermione came up empty. Instead, she met Neville, who had forgotten the password and couldn't get in. Hermione took him back to the common room, which was considered a good deed by chance. Harry and Ron, who learned about this from Neville the next day, couldn't believe that there was such a nosy person in the world. As a result, their attitude towards her naturally became worse. Especially when Ron mentioned what Hermione had done while spreading the news that Malfoy didn't dare to fight. This made the Gryffindor first-year students even more obviously exclude her. Except for Neville. He was still grateful to Hermione for taking him to find Trevor on the train and for bringing him back from outside Gryffindor Tower. In this situation, Hermione would naturally feel lonely. Sherlock was the only person besides Neville who didn't exclude her. He still called her Hermione as before and didn't stop giving her private lessons. After all, in Sherlock's view, these were not a big deal at all. Out of curiosity, Hermione also asked Sherlock. But his answer surprised Hermione greatly. Just ignore them, isn't it? Sherlock didn't understand Hermione's confusion. Since you think you're right, why bother about what others think? He had also been isolated by his classmates when he was studying in the Muggle world. This was not surprising. After all, his personality and actions were originally not likable, always pointing out other people's mistakes sharply, without considering the occasion. But so what? Other people's opinions had no effect on Sherlock at all. Some people did try to bully him. For example, splashing ink on his homework, stuffing beetles in his stationery, adding ingredients to his breakfast, etc. However, all these people's actions mysteriously returned to themselves. Opening their bags to find their books stained with ink, along with a toad, eating and being choked by a mouthful of salt, suspecting their life. There were also those who didn't believe in evil and challenged him on the spot, but after having 2 teeth knocked out, they also subsided. Sherlock's ability to disregard others made Hermione very envious. She also wanted to be like this, but she couldn't do it. If you're really so distressed, I do have a suggestion. Looking at Hermione, who couldn't concentrate because of her distress, Sherlock tried to look at the problem from Hermione's perspective. You cannot take grades so seriously. How is that possible? Hermione, who had always demanded herself to be a top student, immediately retorted subconsciously. Professor Snape is always finding fault and deducting points. If we don't follow the school rules. Miss Hermione, you're short 11 years, oh no, 12 years of life experience is not enough to support your understanding of reality. Hermione. The reality is, either continue to do your own thing and don't care about what others think. After all, you're not a pound, you can't make everyone like you. Or change your mindset and try to integrate into the environment. Although it sounded unpleasant, Hermione understood that Sherlock was qualified to say such things. He himself was the former. She had seen Sherlock's arguably bad words and deeds more than once. For example, saying to Ron and Neville, "You are lowering the intelligence of the entire academy." For example, Dean Thomas was disturbing his thinking just by standing in front of him. And for example, he emphasized just now that he was 12 years old. In Hermione's view, these actions were much more excessive than what she had done. She was just upholding the school rules, but Sherlock was directly attacking people. However, Sherlock didn't care at all, turning a deaf ear to the pointing fingers of others, and always doing his own thing from beginning to end. To this, Hermione could only express her admiration, she couldn't compare. After thinking about it, she still didn't listen to Sherlock's advice. She decided to change her situation in her own way. Chapter 46. Following Sherlock's guidance, Hermione began to change her situation using her own methods. In every class, she spoke more actively and with greater intensity than before, striving to earn points. This action proved to be quite effective. In just 1 month, professors other than Snape had awarded a considerable number of points to Gryffindor. However, even though Hermione single-handedly earned nearly 30 points this season, becoming the top-scoring first year, her treatment in Gryffindor remained unchanged. This was not surprising. Because, to some extent, what she was doing was all in vain. In the eyes of the students, Hermione Granger was a good student, but she always nagged when classmates made mistakes, constantly stopped them from copying each other's homework, and liked to tattle to the teachers. How should I put it? Everyone knew she was right, but no one liked her. Sherlock was helpless about this. He had given his advice, but she didn't listen. Others would not appreciate this kind of one-sided effort that you think is for their own good. Moreover, others didn't need her to do this at all. In the eyes of the Gryffindor Lions, Hermione was purely meddling. When you focus on doing one thing, you feel that time passes very quickly. Unknowingly, 2 whole months had passed since the start of school. The atmosphere in the school also became cheerful. The first-year students were about to welcome their first festival at school. Halloween. After a long period of evolution, this festival had long lost its original religious color and turned into a traditional festival mainly for celebration. Halloween actually lasts 2 days. October 31st is called Halloween Eve. November 1st is called All Saints' Day. Halloween in the popular sense refers to October 31st, which is also the day when the first-year students will hold a celebration banquet. As for Halloween night, it is often called All Hallows' Eve or All Saints' Day. Whenever Halloween comes, children dress up as various cute ghosts and knock on doors from house to house, demanding sweets, otherwise they will cause trouble. It is said that various ghosts and monsters will also mingle in the crowd that night, so adults often dress themselves up as demons and ghosts. In addition, there are also festive customs such as carving pumpkin lanterns, playing pranks, and apple bobbing. In the Muggle world, Halloween is an important festival. For example, Sherlock originally planned to go to school in Yorkshire. The Halloween celebrations there are very famous throughout the UK. Originally, Sherlock thought that the magical world would not celebrate this holiday. But now it seems that he was narrow-minded. The magical world celebrates 4 festivals: Halloween, Christmas, Valentine's Day, and Easter. Valentine's Day is the most out of place among these 4 festivals, giving people a feeling of sneaking in. At Hogwarts, only older students like it. Christmas and Easter have holidays, which is a bit embarrassing after all. The Vatican killed quite a few wizards back then. On Halloween morning, Sherlock woke up to the smell of roasted pumpkin in the corridor. It can be said that from this moment on, the festive atmosphere was already in place. The last class before the event celebration was charms, and the first-year wizards also ushered in new teaching content, the levitation charm. Everyone was very interested in this. Because Professor Flitwick used Neville's pet Trevor, which always liked to abandon its owner and travel alone, as a demonstration. Under the effect of the levitation charm, it achieved the achievement of flying winglessly in the classroom. However, the difficulty of the charm quickly dispelled their high enthusiasm. Compared with the spells learned before, the levitation charm has as many as 8 syllables. Not only must the pronunciation be standard, but the requirements for the casting action are also very high. It can be said that the difficulty has soared. In the spell practice section, according to convention, it was still 2-person group training. Sherlock's partner was Harry, which made the latter very happy. Because Seamus Finnegan had been trying to get his attention. Compared to him, Harry would rather team up with Neville. It's not that Harry looks down on Seamus, but Seamus has a magical ability. As long as a harmless spell is cast by him, it will inexplicably cause an explosion. This is especially obvious in Transfiguration and Charms classes. According to Sherlock's scientific analysis, this may be related to heredity. Seamus Finnegan was one of Sherlock's reasoning subjects when he was waiting for the train at platform 9 3/4 before the start of school. At that time, Sherlock's analysis of him was new student, mother is a witch, father is an ordinary person engaged in the blasting industry, only learned of his wife's identity after marriage. After the start of school, this inference was also confirmed. So, besides the teacher, only a very few students like Sherlock can support him. Harry obviously does not have this ability. As for Neville, who is partnered with Seamus with a bitter face, he can only pray for good fortune. Some people are happy and some are sad. Harry was happy that he was matched with Sherlock, while Hermione was a little frustrated because she was not teamed up with Sherlock. Her partner was Ron. Regarding this matter, Ron was also unwilling. He didn't like Hermione from the moment he met her. Although during this period, because Hermione spoke out for Sherlock and Harry, he raised his favorability towards Hermione a bit. However, Hermione's subsequent actions quickly caused Ron's favorability towards her to drop rapidly. This situation reached its peak after Hermione lectured them that they should not duel with Malfoy and came to catch them late at night. Even after Hermione was enlightened by Sherlock and tried to change the status quo in her own way, it still had no effect. Recently, besides Sherlock and Neville, only Harry can barely say a few words to Hermione. This is still Harry giving Sherlock face. Neville is an introverted and timid character, so the only person who really doesn't reject Hermione is actually Sherlock. But she didn't get to be with Sherlock obviously. Professor Flitwick is not a good observer. Wingardium Leviosa. Ron waved his arms like a windmill and shouted the spell. On the one hand, he brought his annoyance with Hermione into the practice, and on the other hand, he hoped to use this method to make the feather feel his determination. He had heard Harry talk about his experience in flying class. The broom can see through the timidity in your heart. Be confident. It's just that he doesn't look confident at all when he is roaring, but more like he is threatening. So it's useless. Feathers are light, but they are not afraid of threats. It's Wingardium Leviosa. The AR must not only be pronounced, but also said long and clearly. After watching Ron try again and again without success, Hermione finally couldn't help but start lecturing. If you can do it, you do it. Ron was angry, and immediately changed the object of his roar to Hermione when he heard this. Hermione waved her wand without saying a word and recited the spell in a standard London accent. Wingardium Leviosa. The feather floated up very cooperatively and hovered directly in the air above the table. Well done. Professor Flitwick looked excited. Everyone, look, Miss Granger has also succeeded. Gryffindor gains 1 point. The reason for saying also is because Sherlock had already succeeded before Hermione. This was not difficult for him. Even Harry, who was with him, was encouraged. After failing several times in a row, he successfully floated up. So the two had already gained points before Hermione. But Sherlock's score naturally won a round of applause. Not to mention Harry, the cheers when he scored were far greater than Sherlock's. This is the prestige of the savior of the magical world. Only Hermione. No one cares. Chapter 47. The last charms class before Halloween. Following Sherlock and Harry, Hermione earned another point for Gryffindor. The Ravenclaw students who were in class with Gryffindor applauded. This was also a routine. The relationship between Eagle and Lion was okay, and they didn't mind doing such things to flatter each other. However, this time they were surprised to find that although Hermione had earned a point for Gryffindor, she did not receive the same treatment as Sherlock and Harry. Everyone treated her coldly. Obviously, no one bought into Hermione's ostentatious display of her excellence. Even their own people were like this, so the Eagle students naturally enjoyed the leisure and stopped. The scene was once very awkward. Professor Flitwick didn't notice anything wrong and continued to correct the students. Unfortunately, Ron still failed until the bell rang. If it was just like this, it would be fine. Ron felt that he had no talent in charms, and he accepted it. It wasn't a big deal. But Hermione kept complaining. Why won't you listen to me? If you were willing to do as I said, you would definitely be able to make the feather fly. That way, Gryffindor could get another point, and we could close the gap with the other houses. Shut up! Ron, who was already annoyed, couldn't bear it any longer and shouted loudly. You're always nagging, always talking about scores and school rules. Did I come to Hogwarts to listen to you say this? Hermione seemed to be frightened by Ron's sudden change of face. She didn't refute him directly as before, but just held the book in both hands and stared at Ron blankly. Ron was probably holding it in two, and at this time his mouth cannon skills were fully unleashed, comparable to Hermione before. No wonder everyone can't stand you. Honestly, you're like a nightmare. I didn't ask you to help. Never. And I don't care if I get points. Granger, it's been so long, haven't you noticed yet? You don't even have a single friend. With a snap, the book in Hermione's hand fell to the ground. The next moment, tears welled up in her eyes, and she turned and ran without looking back, bumping into Harry along the way. Ron was stunned. He didn't expect Hermione's reaction to be so big. At this moment, he suddenly felt a little regretful. Harry, who was bumped away by Hermione, naturally wouldn't care about Hermione. He looked at Hermione's back as she rushed out of the crowd, and looked back at Ron. You seem to have gone a little too far. So what? I'm just telling the truth. Ron was still stubborn. But this time, even without Sherlock's analysis, Harry could see that the expression on his face was a little unnatural. Obviously, his heart was not as calm as he said. Unexpectedly, Sherlock bent down to pick up the book that Hermione had dropped on the ground, put it in his bag expressionlessly, and said at the same time. Ron is right. Harry looked surprised. Sherlock, even you? Sherlock said lightly, that's just the fact. Okay. Harry sighed. Thinking about it, it was right, with Sherlock's character, saying this sentence was also expected and reasonable. He was just this kind of person. Looking at Ron again, after getting Sherlock's support, he seemed to feel a lot more relieved. Then. But I think you'd better apologize to her later. Harry. Ron. What's the situation, are you jumping back and forth here? Why? Ron couldn't help it, you said I was telling the truth. I can feel that you are very nervous now. Sherlock's eyes stared straight at Ron, under his sharp gaze, Ron turned his head away guiltily. Harry. At this time, Harry had a strong feeling that Ron would definitely be persuaded by Sherlock in the next moment. If you have a clear conscience, of course you don't have to go to her, but you don't. Not everyone can be like you and treat others like air. Ron muttered. He now felt more and more that Sherlock didn't look like an 11-year-old boy at all. Not to mention his peers, even his prefect brother Percy might not be as mature as Sherlock. Although Sherlock didn't say much, Ron was still persuaded as expected. However, since running out, Hermione has not returned. She did not reappear in Charms class, and was not seen all afternoon. Ron wanted to ask others, but he couldn't save face after all. There were quite a few people who saw him scolding Hermione away. It wasn't until he went to the Halloween banquet that he accidentally heard the twin sisters Parvati Patil and Padma Patil telling her friends that Hermione was crying sadly in the girls' bathroom and refused to be comforted. Ron was even more embarrassed when he heard this. With things on his mind, even the colorful Halloween decorations in the hall were not appealing. Even so, Ron didn't think things were too serious at this time. Because the Halloween dinner was much richer than usual. The delicious food was so fragrant that he immediately transformed into a food fighter. He thought about filling his stomach first, and then bringing some food to Hermione later. Putting himself in her shoes, Ron felt that even if Hermione was still angry, she would be fine as long as she had a good meal. Then he began to eat heartily. While eating, he threw Hermione to the back of his mind. Until halfway through the meal, Professor Quirrell, who had been made a joke of, suddenly rushed into the hall. His face was full of horror, and the much criticized scarf was crookedly worn on his head. Such an appearance naturally made everyone's attention focus on him. He stumbled to Professor Dumbledore, probably because he was too nervous. He didn't care that all the teachers and students were watching him, and said stutteringly, "Troll. A troll has entered the dungeon. I thought you knew." As soon as he finished speaking, he fell headlong onto the floor. He actually fainted directly. This made several professors who originally wanted to blame him for not speaking in the right place lose their target at once. As for Quirrell's actions, it was like a stone thrown into a calm lake, causing the entire hall to be in chaos. Silence. Even Dumbledore could only use his wand to explode a few purple fireworks in this situation to control the scene. At this time, he was calm and composed, completely without the crazy appearance at the opening ceremony. "Prefects, please immediately lead the students of each house to the dormitory." His state also affected the students, and Percy was naturally familiar with it. "I'm the prefect. Upperclassmen, please give way, let the freshmen go first. Please note, I am the prefect." Chapter 48. In the midst of the chaos, Harry and Ron followed Percy closely. Despite his usual complaints, Percy took good care of his younger brothers in this critical moment. "Don't worry, as long as you listen to my instructions, you don't need to be afraid of any trolls. Now, follow me closely. Hey, you in front, make way, I'm a prefect." To be fair, Percy was a very responsible prefect. However, on their way back to the Gryffindor Tower, they encountered crowds of people hurrying in different directions. While struggling to squeeze past a group of confused Hufflepuff students, even with Percy flashing his prefect badge, Harry and Ron still couldn't keep up with him. Ron immediately became anxious. Just then, Harry suddenly grabbed Ron's arm. Having spent a lot of time with Sherlock, Harry had also been influenced, and his divergent thinking had been strengthened. He pulled Ron, who was trying to squeeze up to Percy, and said with a serious expression, "I just remembered Granger." Ron, still not realizing the seriousness of the situation, asked with a puzzled look, "Granger? What's wrong with her?" Harry looked into Ron's eyes and said, word by word, "She doesn't know about the troll." Ron's face paled instantly. "Damn it, Sherlock." Nowadays, when encountering problems they can't solve, both Harry and Ron's first reaction is to ask Sherlock for help. However, Ron realized he couldn't find him. "Sherlock? Sherlock? Where's Sherlock?" The two looked around, only to discover that Sherlock had disappeared at this crucial moment. Harry immediately began to recall. After a moment, he remembered that he hadn't seen Sherlock since Quirrell appeared. No wonder he felt like something was missing along the way. He wasn't among the Gryffindor first years following Percy. Damn it, he must have gone to find Granger on his own. Ron said with certainty. Harry also nodded. Not many people in the school could make Sherlock call them by their first name. Not to mention their first name, Sherlock couldn't even remember some people's last names, or rather, he simply couldn't be bothered to remember them. After all, according to his theory that the brain is a hard drive, there's no need to store useless knowledge. Making a decision without Sherlock for the first time, Harry and Ron were both nervous and excited. The Gryffindor traits within them made them both eager to act. "So, are we going or not? Let's go, let's go, let's go. Be careful, don't let Percy see us. Sherlock is really too unkind, is he afraid we'll hold him back?" The two lowered their bodies, complaining as they mingled with the Hufflepuff crowd as they passed by. After sneaking past an empty side corridor, the two sped up and headed straight for the dungeons. As soon as they turned the corner, a stench hit them in the face. How should I describe it? If I had to, it would be the smell of Ron's month unwashed socks mixed with a month uncleaned public toilet. Perhaps with the addition of some special flavors from Bertie Bott's Every Flavor beans. Both of their facial muscles twitched as they held their breaths as much as possible. Otherwise, even if they didn't faint on the spot, they were afraid they would throw up directly. When the two cautiously peeked their heads out, they were immediately stunned by the scene before them. When Quirrell appeared in the Great Hall and announced the troll, Sherlock immediately frowned, realizing that the situation was not simple. He had to thank Professor McGonagall for this. In order to fulfill his promise to her, he had been attending the Defense Against the Dark Arts class for the past 2 weeks, so he had become quite familiar with Professor Quirrell. After first hearing about Quirrell's story, Sherlock instinctively felt that his story of a drastic change in personality after meeting a vampire was a bit fabricated. Harry had even questioned it at the time, but because the conditions weren't right, Sherlock didn't continue to deduce. However, as he no longer missed Defense Against the Dark Arts classes, Quirrell's words and actions were all observed by him. This person, there's something wrong with him. If he were in the Muggle world, he would definitely investigate the matter thoroughly. But not in the magical world. One reason is that although Quirrell seems very unreliable, he is, after all, an adult wizard. If Sherlock's deduction is correct, his strength is not bad at all. Acting rashly would be absolutely unwise. Sherlock would never let foolishness replace courage. The second reason is time. For Sherlock, time is always not enough. Every professor at Hogwarts has secrets, and when Quirrell doesn't show a threat, his affairs can be put on hold. Until today. When he saw Quirrell stumbling in, Sherlock took less than a second to deduce the cause and effect. He acted immediately. As long as he acted fast enough, he could figure out the whole story at once. And save Hermione by the way. The subsequent development was just as he expected. He arrived in the basement even before the troll. Although he was less than half a minute faster than the troll. But that little bit of time was enough for him to drag Hermione out before she was blocked in the girls' bathroom by the troll. It was a literal drag. Hermione was almost speechless. Her limbs were weak, her body was limp, and she could only walk because Sherlock was dragging her. This was also reasonable. Even if she is usually strong, she is just an 11-year-old girl. After crying in the toilet for most of the day, she was already hungry and tired. At this moment, suddenly seeing a behemoth like a troll, her mind had already gone blank. After all, looking at the illustrated introduction in books and seeing a troll with your own eyes are completely different concepts. What's more, the troll in front of her was 12 feet tall, a head taller than Hagrid. But even though Hagrid is huge, his appearance is still that of a normal human. This thing is different. At first glance, its entire body seemed to be composed of huge piles of gravel. The skin all over its body was grayish like granite, with dead leaves and silt hanging in more than one place. The proportions of the limbs were extremely uncoordinated, the 2 legs were short and thick, like 2 tree stumps. The 2 arms were too long, and the thick wooden club in its hand was dragging on the ground. The small head was hidden in the neck, and it was almost invisible if you didn't have good eyesight. Of course, the most prominent feature was the pungent stench. If this creature appeared in a game, it might be a bit comical. But once it appears in reality, the effect of megalophobia is immediately maximized. As an 11-year-old girl, even a witch, it is not surprising to lose the ability to act when facing a troll. As for Sherlock, his mental quality was already superior, and he was also prepared, so he was unexpectedly calm at the moment. Chapter 49. The moment Sherlock saw the troll, a passage of descriptive text flashed through his mind. Trolls are native to Scandinavia, but can now be found in Britain, Ireland, and Northern Europe. They prefer to eat raw meat, but are not picky about their prey, capturing everything from wild animals to humans, and especially like fish. Their living habits are extremely violent, often resorting to violence for no reason. Based on appearance and habitat, they can be divided into 3 types: mountain trolls, forest trolls, and river trolls. Mountain trolls are the largest and most dangerous. Both Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, a required book for first-year students, and The Ultimate Survival Handbook, which Sherlock bought out of interest, describe trolls. The former is more inclined towards popular science, mostly theoretical. The latter is based on the author's personal experience, with no theory, only practice. At this moment, Sherlock quickly retrieved them from his memory attic. Unfortunately, the one appearing before him and Hermione was the most troublesome mountain troll. People's physiques cannot be generalized. I once defeated a mountain troll with just a long sword in a state of extreme anger. Regrettably, the protein content of trolls is very low, less than 1/6 of that of beef, and even without the head, it is not suitable for consumption. For those of you reading this book, my advice is not to confront them head-on unless necessary. Unless you are a powerful wizard, or possess a physique as strong as mine. After seeing this troll with his own eyes, Sherlock deeply agreed with the author's statement. Therefore, without saying a word, he covered Hermione's mouth and dragged her out of the girls' bathroom. If she were treated like this on a normal day, Hermione certainly wouldn't cooperate. But Hermione was now tired and hungry, and it's no exaggeration to say that she had already run out of tears. So, running into Sherlock at this time meant she would let him do whatever he wanted. As for the troll, it stopped by a door, peering inside. After a while, probably not finding its target, it finally made a difficult decision with its small head. Under the gaze of Sherlock and Hermione, the troll, which had broken into the basement, slowly turned and left, its flat, rough, calloused feet moving. Although the acting is clumsy, it's smarter than I imagined. Watching the trolls departing back, Sherlock muttered to himself. At this moment, Hermione finally recovered from her shock. She silently removed Sherlock's hand from her mouth, stood up straight, and straightened her clothes. Hearing Sherlock's words, she couldn't help but ask suspiciously, "What did you say?" "Someone's coming." Sherlock didn't answer, but pointed to the side, dragging Hermione away to hide again. She had been extremely nervous just now and hadn't felt anything when Sherlock dragged her away, but now she couldn't help but feel a little strange. But the next moment, her gaze was drawn to the figure that suddenly appeared. Because that person was their potions professor, the head of Slytherin House. Severus Snape. Watching him walk through the corridor and disappear from her sight, Hermione couldn't help but ask. "Professor Snape? Why is he here alone? Everyone should be celebrating Halloween in the Great Hall at this time, right? Also, Sherlock, why did you come here to find me?" Once she returned to normal, Hermione's clever intelligence reoccupied the high ground, and a series of questions followed. "We'll talk about these things later." Sherlock didn't want to explain these things now, his gaze turned to the side. "Let's get those two first. What did you say?" Hermione didn't react for a moment. "Oh, dear Hermione," Sherlock turned to look at her, with a hint of playfulness in his eyes, "if you had observed carefully enough, you would have noticed there are two more people there." Following the direction Sherlock indicated, Hermione was surprised to find two heads slowly peeking out from behind a large griffin statue. One of them was none other than the culprit who had almost trapped her here, Ron Weasley. As for the other, it was naturally Ron's best friend, Harry Potter. When Harry and Ron saw the troll's massive body with their own eyes, they were stunned. They held their breath, not daring to make a sound, for fear of being heard by the troll. They finally waited for the troll to leave, but then there was another sound behind them. The two originally thought that Percy had followed them, and quickly hid behind the griffin statue on the side. But they saw Snape. Harry immediately whispered to Ron beside him, "Why isn't he with the other teachers? What is he doing in the underground classroom?" "How would I know?" Ron seemed a little irritable. He was, after all, a good person. Although he had spoken harshly to Hermione today, he had never thought of harming her. Now, thinking that Hermione might run into the troll because of him, he was both guilty and regretful. "He's heading to the 4th floor." Harry's attention was still on Snape. After all, the 4th floor was a restricted area that Dumbledore had specifically mentioned. Ron raised his hand to signal, "Harry, we're here to find." Before he could finish speaking, a voice interrupted him. "I suggest you don't focus on him. Sherlock." The moment he saw Sherlock, Harry was overjoyed. The feeling of finding his backbone again couldn't be any happier. As for Ron, he immediately noticed Hermione beside Sherlock. He couldn't help but breathe a long sigh of relief. "Sherlock, you really came to save her." Strangely, when he saw Hermione standing safely beside Sherlock, for some reason, he suddenly had a very subtle thought. "If I were the one who saved her, that would be great." Ron was startled by his own thought as soon as it arose. "Damn, how could I think like that? It's most important that Granger is safe and sound. Maybe it's because I hurt her, so I want to save her with my own hands?" "Yeah, that must be it. Ron thought. Well, sort of, Sherlock nodded, it's also to verify a hypothesis of mine. What hypothesis? By the way, did you see the troll just now? Of course, Sherlock looked into the distance, his eyes gradually deepening, he looked at Harry and Ron, I want to continue following it, do you want to come along? Let's go, let's go, let's go. Now that Hermione was safe, the adventurous factors in the others' bodies were immediately stirred up. Tracking a professor who is also the head of a house, just thinking about it is exciting. It? Not him. Only Hermione noticed Sherlock's pronoun. Hermione, you've spotted the blind spot, Sherlock smiled at Hermione, affirming her statement, it is it. Harry and Ron then reacted, wait, aren't we following Snape? No, it's the troll. What? Harry, Hermione, and Ron all widened their eyes. Don't look at me like that, Sherlock said calmly, if my deduction is correct, what follows is the key, do you still want to go? Of course. Although they felt that Sherlock's behavior at this time was a bit inexplicable, the three companions did not hesitate to follow him. Completion check, the entire original text has been translated. Length comparison, the translated text is of comparable length to the original Chinese text, ensuring no content was omitted. Confirmation statement, the translation is complete, accurate, and of high quality. Chapter 50. Tracking a troll isn't a difficult task. You just need to follow that awful smell. The downside is you can't get too close. Even with 4 people now, the 4 of them combined still can't directly fight a mountain troll. Fortunately, the troll isn't very agile. It's a typical example of being simple-minded and well-developed. So Sherlock and his group quickly returned from the basement along the stairs back to the corridor. After following the troll for a while, when its figure appeared in their sight again, Sherlock suddenly stopped. What's wrong? The 3 who were following Sherlock were all stunned. It's here. Sherlock said as he walked in a direction completely opposite to the troll. This. The 3, who were already puzzled by Sherlock's behavior of tracking the troll, were even more confused. Choosing a troll instead of Snape as the target of tailing was already inexplicable. Now that they've followed him all the way, why are they parting ways again? The 3 looked at each other. Seeing Sherlock turn another corner and about to disappear from their sight, they finally followed him. Unexpectedly, as soon as they followed Sherlock around the corner, the 3 were shocked by the scene before them. Ron blurted out, "Holy hell!" The originally clean and tidy ground was now spelled out with 5 huge English letters in blood. The visual impact brought by the strong contrast even exceeded the feeling of the first time they saw the tall and majestic Hogwarts. After a while, Hermione, who had been in close contact with the troll earlier and had developed some immunity, tried to spell them out. R-A-C-H-E. Ratch. The 3, except for Sherlock, looked at each other in dismay. The act of leaving a mark in such a bloody way was really a bit shocking to them. After a while, Harry swallowed and whispered, "What does this mean?" "How would I know?" Ron touched his nose, "This kind of thing shouldn't be asked of him." Ratch. Ratch. Could it be Rachel? Hermione said hesitantly, could it be that they originally planned to write Rachel, but were disturbed by something, so they didn't finish writing it? Harry quickly asked, "Are you saying this represents a person's name?" "Her name is Rachel." Hermione nodded, and said uncertainly, "I can only think of this." As she said that, she looked towards Sherlock, wanting to ask him for confirmation. Harry and Ron did the same. But when the 3 turned their attention to Sherlock, they found that the latter had already started taking action. Sherlock took out a tape measure and a circular magnifying glass from somewhere, and walked around the blood letters. He sometimes stood, sometimes knelt, and sometimes even lay on the ground, completely ignoring the harsh and terrifying surroundings. The 3 wanted to speak several times, but looking at Sherlock's busy appearance, they finally forced themselves to hold back. About 5 minutes later, Sherlock began to examine the blood letters on the ground with a magnifying glass. After observing each letter very carefully, he seemed satisfied and put away the tape measure and magnifying glass. At this time, the 3 noticed that Sherlock had originally placed them in a specially sewn large pocket on the outside of his robe. "Thank you for being quiet, allowing me to find what I wanted before they arrived." Sherlock turned around and said to the 3 with a smile. "Some people say that genius is actually the ability to endure endless hard work, but I personally think this definition is not appropriate, but if it is only used in investigation work, it is just right." Who are they? What do you want? What did you find? The three spoke almost simultaneously, but asked completely different questions. Sherlock's gaze passed over the three and looked behind them. Anyway, I'll be interrupted as soon as I speak, so it's better to wait a moment. The three became more and more puzzled by Sherlock's mysterious behavior. Ron, who was the most impatient, was about to speak when he suddenly heard a loud sound of footsteps. Almost at the same time, Professor McGonagall rushed over first, followed by Professor Snape and Professor Quirrell. Quirrell, who was walking at the end, immediately as soon as he saw the huge blood letters, sat down on the spot, clutched his chest tightly, and began to sob weakly. Snape immediately showed a disgusted look, took 2 steps to the side, and distanced himself from Quirrell. However, his gloomy gaze quickly shifted to Harry Potter. What tricks are you playing? This time McGonagall did not defend Harry. However, she looked at Sherlock and said in a cold voice, "Mr. Holmes, I need an explanation." She just glanced at it and saw that Sherlock was the leader of the group. Facing the angry Professor McGonagall, Sherlock smiled slightly. Explanation? Isn't it obvious? Harry, Hermione, Ron. As expected of you. It seems that the proud Gryffindor is even too lazy to explain, Snape sneered, looking like he was enjoying the show, even when facing his own dean. McGonagall didn't speak, but just looking at her pale lips and pale face, one could already imagine her anger. Don't make me repeat myself, give me an explanation, why aren't you staying in the dormitory obediently? Isn't it obvious? Okay. Sherlock was a little helpless, he really thought the answer was obvious. In this situation, shouldn't one be able to deduce what happened with just one glance? There is no need to explain. Unfortunately, the situation is stronger than people, so he can only patiently say. During the Halloween party, I noticed that Hermione was not present. It just so happened that Ron made her angry this morning, and coupled with the descriptions of other students, it is not difficult to deduce that she was alone in the girls' bathroom. When Professor Quirrell pointed out that the troll appeared in the underground classroom, I guessed that it was likely to encounter Hermione. So I rushed to the underground classroom as soon as possible, wanting to take her away. Hearing this, Ron raised his eyebrows at Harry, silently conveying the message with his eyes. See? This guy is really afraid that we will hold him back. I was lucky enough to find her before the troll met Hermione. Then I met Harry and Ron, who arrived for the same reason. Because the strength of the enemy and ourselves was too different, we could only leave in a roundabout way. Then we walked all the way here. That's right, that's exactly what happened. As soon as Sherlock finished speaking, Hermione immediately stood up to testify for him. This made Professor McGonagall's face look a little better. As for Harry and Ron, she directly ignored them. The testimony of these two people is not credible at all. Is this what you call obvious? However, before she could speak, she heard Snape coldly say, "Mr. Holmes, or do you think the professors can guess what you did before just by observing?" Snape was obviously being sarcastic. After all, he never speaks nicely. Unexpectedly, Holmes turned his head and asked in a matter-of-course tone, "Isn't it?" Snape was stunned for a moment, and was about to speak when he heard Holmes say very quickly, "For example, I can now see that you have just fought with the troll and have subdued it. Also, before that, you tried to pass a road guarded by a large canine, but it bit your right leg." As soon as he finished speaking, Snape's face became even gloomier than McGonagall's just now.